This mysterious evening we will delve into a slow and profound exploration of the ancient oracle of Delphi and its enigmatic world. Imagine a flickering light barely piercing the gloom, a soft blanket enveloping you as the day's hustle gradually yields to silence. Your thoughts drift far away, and you picture yourself walking a winding, dusty mountain path somewhere in ancient Greece. The gentle Mediterranean sun warms your shoulders as you steadily ascend the slopes of the majestic Mount Parnassus. Below, as far as the eye can see, olive groves stretch like an emerald carpet to the horizon, where they merge with the distant shimmering sea. But your path does not lead to the coast. You move steadily upward, following a trail polished by thousands of feet over hundreds of years. Now, with the light dimmed and a soft background hum, perhaps from a fan, barely audible, we are ready to begin our immersion into history. As you journey, you begin to notice other travellers following the same path. Here is a merchant from Athens, his donkey heavily laden with pottery for sale. Nearby walks a farmer's wife, carefully carrying a small offering wrapped in linen. A little further, a young soldier, still in bronze armour, though his shield is slung across his back and his spear rests lightly in his hand. All move with the same quiet, focused purpose. All are ascending to the same cherished destination. You are all heading to Delphi, the most sacred and revered site in the ancient Greek world. This is the very place where the god Apollo himself was believed to descend to commune with mortals. However, the question arises, how did this mountain acquire such exceptional significance? How did this rocky slope, overgrown with wild laurel trees, transform into the pulsating centre of the ancient world? The story of its grandeur began long before the construction of temples and the appearance of priests, in those distant times when the world was young and the ancient gods still walked freely upon the earth. This mountainside was sacred even then, but its sanctity was not associated with Apollo. Long ago, before the golden-haired god of music and prophecy claimed this place as his own, it belonged to an entirely different being. Deep beneath the rocky strata, in a cave that gaped like a huge maw in the mountainside, lived Python. And this was no small snake one might find basking on a garden wall. Python was monstrous, a serpent of such gigantic proportions that, when it coiled around the mountain, its mighty body was said to have created the very paths travellers now ascended to the summit. Python was ancient even when the world was young, born from the earth itself. Some legends say that when the great waters of Deucalion's flood finally receded, leaving the earth muddy and fertile, this massive serpent had dwelt in the cave for so long that the local inhabitants built their own sacred traditions around it. In that cave an oracle already existed, a means for mortals to communicate with divine powers. However, this oracle served older gods, primordial earthly forces that held sway before Zeus and his Olympian family claimed the heavens. People from all over the Greek world flocked here to ask their questions of Python's oracle. They brought humble offerings of honey and barley cakes, and the priestess in turn interpreted the serpent's movements, the subtle tremor of the earth as Python stirred in its deep cave, and the mysterious patterns of steam rising from the rock fissures. It was a peaceful arrangement, lasting for generations, until Apollo decided that this place should belong to him. Apollo was young then, by the standards of the gods. He was born on the floating island of Delos with his twin sister Artemis. His mother, Leto, wandered the world, seeking refuge for childbirth because Hera, as always consumed by jealousy over Zeus's children with other women, forbade any land from offering her shelter. But Apollo grew with astonishing speed like all divine children. Just days after his birth, he was tall, incredibly handsome, and strong. His golden hair caught the light as if woven from the sun itself. His voice could make even stones weep with its wondrous beauty when he sang. And he inherited from his father Zeus an unwavering determination to get what he wanted. Apollo yearned to have his own oracle, his own sacred place where mortals could come to inquire about the future. But he didn't just want any mountain or any cave. He wanted the best. He desired to claim the most renowned oracle in the known world. He wanted Delphi. So Apollo ascended the mountain path, just as you might walk it today, though his divine feet likely raised no dust clouds and his breath certainly didn't quicken with the effort of the climb. Gods do not become winded. When he reached the sacred cave, he called forth Python. Now, what happened next depends on who tells this ancient story. Some traditions say it was a grand battle where Python's massive coils crushed trees and Apollo's silver arrows flew like falling stars, tearing through the air. Others assert it was more like a cosmic negotiation full of divine posturing and threats, but without much violence. But what we know for certain is this: when that encounter concluded, Python was dead, and Apollo declared the cave and the oracle his own dominion. One might expect Apollo to simply adopt the existing traditions, allowing things to proceed as before. But Apollo was a god of change, of new ideas, of the order that springs from art and music and from deeply considered thought. The old earth oracle was mysterious and primal, shrouded in steam, serpentine dreams, and ancient wisdom rising from the mountain's depths. Apollo's oracle was to be different. First, he needed to purify the place. The ancient Greeks believed that death, even the death of a being as ancient and powerful as Python, left a spiritual stain that needed to be removed before new sacred work could begin. So Apollo performed cleansing rituals, burning fragrant herbs and pouring wine and oil upon the stones, chanting hymns whose echoes reverberated through the mountain peaks. But even purification was not enough. Apollo had killed Python, and in the ancient world this act made him a killer. Even gods had to answer for murder. So Apollo left his new sanctuary and journeyed far to the land of the Hyperboreans in the distant north, where he spent 8 years in exile, atoning for Python's death. 8 long years. Imagine this mountain without its new god, empty of pilgrims, with the cave entrance dark and silent. The local inhabitants must have wondered if their sacred place would ever come alive again. The merchants, farmers, and soldiers who had ascended the mountain path for generations must have felt lost, cut off from the divine guidance they had always known. But after 8 years, Apollo returned. And when he returned, he brought with him the most beautiful temple the ancient world had ever seen. In truth, that's not quite right. Apollo didn't so much bring a temple as he inspired its construction. The returned god filled the local communities with a divine enthusiasm, a shared vision of what this sacred place could become. Stonemasons began to arrive from all over Greece, along with architects, artists, and craftsmen of all kinds. The temple they built was designed to be perfect in every way, Its columns were precisely proportioned according to mathematical principles that would later be called the golden ratio. Its sculptures were carved by the greatest artists of the era. And inside, in the inner sanctuary, where only the priestess could enter, Apollo placed his sacred tripod, a three-legged bronze seat that would become the throne of his oracle. But wait, if Apollo was the god speaking through the oracle, why did he need a priestess at all? Why didn't he speak directly to the people who came with questions? This is one of those marvelous mysteries of the ancient world that we will likely never fully understand. Perhaps Apollo, being a god of harmony and balance, believed that divine truth needed to be filtered through human understanding to be useful to mortal minds. Perhaps the overwhelming power of a god's direct voice would be too much for ordinary people. Or perhaps, and this explanation makes the most sense if you quietly think about it, perhaps Apollo understood that the very act of asking questions and seeking guidance was as important as the answers themselves. Think about it deeply. You spend hours ascending a dusty mountain path. You stand in line with other pilgrims, each carrying their hopes and uncertainties. All of you are nervous, hopeful, and uncertain. You make your offering and speak your question aloud to the priestess, who serves as the god's voice, and then you listen, truly listen, to the answer you receive. This entire process changes you to your core. The journey, the waiting, the very moment of asking the question, the careful attention to the answer, all of it together creates a kind of meditation, a deep reflection on your life and your choices that you might never have undertaken if Apollo had simply appeared in your living room and answered your questions while you folded laundry. The oracle at Delphi was not just a way to get information about the future. It was about the profound experience of seeking wisdom, about the spiritual discipline of asking the right questions and being genuinely open to guidance, even if that guidance might not be what you wanted to hear. And Apollo's oracle became known for giving guidance that was technically accurate, but required careful interpretation. The god was not trying to be difficult or enigmatic simply for the sake of mystery. He was teaching people to reflect deeply on their choices, to consider multiple possibilities, to approach important decisions with the kind of careful deliberation that leads to true wisdom. A quiet morning in Delphi. People flocked here. Oh, how numerous these pilgrims were. Among them were mighty kings and humble farmers, valiant soldiers and shrewd merchants, young brides full of hope and anxious mothers seeking solace, wise philosophers and talented poets, as well as astute politicians. They arrived from all corners of the vast Greek world, and over time their stream extended beyond its borders. With them they brought generous gifts, shining gold and silver, exquisite bronze tripods and the finest fabrics, animals destined for sacrifice, and at times simple flowers gathered along the mountain path. Slowly but steadily, years, decades, and entire centuries passed, and Apollo's oracle, located in Delphi, transformed, becoming something far more significant than just a sacred site. It became a true spiritual axis of an entire civilization. This was a unique space where Greeks, arriving from disparate city-states, could meet on common ground. Here, fateful decisions regarding war and peace were made, plans for establishing new colonies were discussed, laws and festivals were instituted, and, of course, the greatest questions of human existence were brought in search of divine guidance. The god, who was once depicted as a young divine rebel asserting his rights to another sacred cave for his own ambition, created something truly holy, a place where heaven touched earth, where the boundless wisdom of the gods could provide answers to the earthly anxieties of human hearts. Late at night, when the last pilgrim, having received their answer, had already begun the journey back down the mountain, when the temple lights burned dimly and the entire mountain plunged into peaceful darkness, Apollo himself would sometimes take his golden lyre and draw from it music that echoed from the peaks to the deepest valleys. This music was so beautiful that even wild animals would approach the temple steps to listen. It seemed to encapsulate all the joy and sorrow of mortal life, transformed into something eternal and perfect. The god whose primary function was to foretell the future found his true calling. It was not merely to predict future events, but to inspire people to reflect deeply on what was to come. Not just to answer questions, but to teach people to ask more meaningful questions. Tomorrow, when the sun once again rises over Mount Parnassus, and the temple columns catch the first rays, new pilgrims will begin their ascent on the ancient path, treading in the footsteps of countless seekers who came before them. All will hope to hear the voice of a God who preferred to speak through human wisdom rather than divine command. But how exactly did this oracle function day to day? What was it like to live and work in the most sacred place in the ancient world? And to grasp this, one must ascend a little higher into the mountains and peer into their mysteries. The rooster crows just as the first pale glimmers of light touch the peaks of Mount Parnassus. In the valley, the world still sleeps beneath a soft blanket of pre-dawn darkness. But here in Delphi, the sacred precinct is already beginning to stir. A man awakens in his small stone house, built into the hillside, one of dozens of such dwellings clustered around the great temple like children gathered at their mother's skirt. Through his narrow window, he sees the temple columns already catching the early light, their marble surfaces beginning to glow with a warm, honeyed radiance that makes them look less like stone and more like solidified sunlight. This is his home. He is one of the many people who live here year-round, whose entire lives revolve around maintaining this sacred place and serving the thousands of pilgrims who ascend the mountain in search of Apollo's guidance. His day begins, as every day in Delphi does, with a ritual of purification. Before he can enter the sacred precinct, before he can touch any holy objects or perform any of his duties, he must cleanse himself of the ordinary world's influence. He descends the hillside to the Castalian spring, where cold, pure water gushes from deep within the mountain and flows in a constant stream to the valley below. The spring is considered sacred to Apollo and to the Muses, those 9 divine sisters who inspire all art, poetry, and music. Legend has it that anyone who drinks from this spring or bathes in its waters will be blessed with poetic inspiration. For him and the other temple servants, however, the spring serves a more practical purpose. Its icy water is the perfect way to wash away sleep and prepare the mind for the sacred work ahead. He is not alone at the spring. Other early risers are already there, temple priests performing their morning ablutions, a few pilgrims who arrived late last night and wished to purify themselves before approaching the oracle, even some local shepherds who bring their flocks to graze on the mountain slopes. All nod politely, but conversations are whispered. The early morning hours in Delphi are a time for quiet contemplation, for allowing the sacred atmosphere of the place to sink deep into one's being. After he has washed his hands and face and offered a brief prayer to Apollo, he ascends back towards the temple but does not go directly there. First, he has other duties. He works in the treasury of the Athenians, one of many small marble buildings lining the sacred way, the path pilgrims follow as they ascend to the temple. Each of these treasuries was built by a different Greek city to house their offerings to Apollo, and to showcase their wealth and piety to visitors from rival cities. The Athenian treasury is particularly beautiful. Its walls are covered with marble reliefs depicting the adventures of Theseus and Heracles. But now, in the grey pre-dawn light, he is less concerned with artistic beauty than with practical matters. He needs to check the locks, ensure no one has attempted to break in during the night, and prepare for the day's visitors. Inside the treasury, the air is cool and still. Golden objects gleam softly in the dim light filtering through the doorway. There are tripods made of precious metals, their 3 legs carved to look like serpents in honour of Python, whom Apollo slew. There are silver bowls, intricately engraved with scenes of battles and feasts. There are bronze mirrors polished to perfection, their surfaces reflecting his face like dark water. But the most precious of all are offerings that cannot be displayed. These are scrolls of papyrus and parchment containing records of all the prophecies given by Apollo's oracle over generations. These documents are the true treasure of Delphi. More valuable than all the gold and silver combined, they represent hundreds of years of divine guidance, a written record of how the gods shaped the history of the Greek world. He carefully checks each container, ensuring the scrolls are protected from dampness and mice. Some of these prophecies are famous throughout the ancient world. Others are personal, given to ordinary people asking about ordinary concerns. Should I marry this person? Will my sick child recover? Is this a good time to plant my crops? As he works, he hears the temple precinct come alive around him, footsteps on the stone pathways, the soft swish of brooms sweeping dust from marble floors, the gentle lowing of cattle being led up the mountain for sacrifice, voices quietly exchanging greetings as the various temple workers begin their daily tasks. By the time he finishes his work in the treasury, the sun has cleared the eastern peaks, and the temple precinct is bathed in golden light. Now comes the most beautiful part of his day, the morning procession. Every day in Delphi begins with a solemn procession from the sacred spring to the temple. Priests, dressed in white robes and crowned with laurel wreaths, walk slowly along the sacred way while musicians play flutes and lyres. The melody is always the same, an ancient hymn to Apollo, sung in Delphi for so many generations that no one remembers who first composed it. He joins the procession with all the other temple workers and any pilgrims who have arrived early enough to participate. The pace is deliberately slow, meditative. This is not just a way to get from one place to another. It is a ritual that helps everyone, priests, servants and pilgrims, transition from the ordinary world of daily concerns to the sacred realm where gods speak to mortals. As he walks, he passes all the treasuries and monuments that make Delphi famous. The treasury of the Siphnians, with its astonishing marble caryatids, columns carved as graceful women supporting the roof on their heads. The monument of the Naxians, topped by a sphinx carved from a single block of marble. The treasury of the Thebans, where Alexander the Great once came to ask Apollo's blessing before he set out to conquer the world. Each building tells a story. Each represents some triumph or tragedy, some moment when a Greek city felt compelled to thank Apollo for his guidance or ask for his protection. Passing them each morning, he is reminded that Delphi is not just a religious site. It is a place where the entire Greek world comes to make sense of its history and plan its future. The procession reaches the temple just in time for the morning sacrifice. A perfect white bull, its horns gilded and its body adorned with garlands of flowers, is led to the altar standing before the temple's main entrance. The animal seems calm, almost sleepy in the warm morning sunlight. The priests carefully inspect it, looking for any blemish or sign of ill health that might make it unsuitable as an offering to the god. But this bull is perfect, as it always is. The people of Delphi take great pride in offering Apollo only the very best. Swiftly and humanely, the animal is sacrificed. Its blood washes over the ancient altar stones, while prayers and solemn hymns ascend to the brightening sky. This ritual of sacrifice serves several crucial functions. First, it provides meat for the temple kitchens daily, feeding hundreds of people. Second, it generates sacred smoke, which, like a bridge, carries human supplications to the divine realm. Finally, it establishes the necessary ritual purity, an indispensable precondition for Apollo to utter his prophecies through his oracle. It should be noted that the oracle does not operate daily. In fact, prophecies are uttered by her only once a month, specifically on the 7th day after the new moon, a date particularly revered as Apollo's birthday. And even during this sacred period, the possibility of divination arises exclusively under favourable omens, when the gods clearly indicate their readiness to communicate with mortals at that specific moment. Today is not a day for the oracle to work. Today's time is called a maintenance day by the priests, a period set aside for meticulous cleaning and organisation, for receiving numerous visitors seeking to offer gifts or clarification regarding temple rituals and procedures, and for transcribing important documents and updating records that track cities fulfilling their obligatory tributes to Apollo. Thus, instead of the intense and mystical aura that usually envelops the oracle's divination sessions, today the temple has a calmer, almost cozy atmosphere. Temple servants diligently sweep dust from the smooth marble floors and carefully polish the bronze elements until they gleam. Scribes, settled in shady niches, painstakingly transcribe ancient prophecies onto new papyrus scrolls. Artisans, meanwhile, are busy repairing damage to buildings and monuments, their hammers emitting a soft, melodic clang as they strike stone and metal. A significant part of the morning is dedicated to helping organize new offerings brought by pilgrims who arrived the previous day. Among them is an elegant silver bowl from Corinth, engraved with a prayer for Apollo's protection of merchant ships. There is also a bronze mirror from Sparta, a gift from a woman whose son was miraculously cured of fever after her earnest prayers to the god. An exquisite small ivory figurine, arriving from some distant colony, is skillfully carved, depicting Apollo playing his lyre. Each of these offerings is meticulously registered: who the donor is, the date of presentation, and the essence of the request made to Apollo. These records serve a dual function, both practical and spiritual. From a practical standpoint, they are indispensable for temple administrators, allowing them to track the immense temple wealth and ensure the safekeeping of property, preventing its loss or theft. Spiritually, they carefully preserve the memory of each worshipper's relationship with the god, forming a kind of inexhaustible dialogue between Apollo and his devotees, extending across many generations. Around midday, as the sun reaches its zenith and the majestic marble columns cast distinct, graphic shadows on the temple floor, afternoon visitors begin to arrive. These are not the impatient pilgrims who come here seeking prophecies. In a sense, they are more like tourists, wealthy Greeks from various polis whose desire is to behold the famed oracle site, offer humble gifts, and upon returning home, tell their friends about visiting the most revered sanctuary in the civilized world. Often the narrator acts as a guide for these visitors, accompanying them around the sacred precinct and explaining in detail the history and significance of the various buildings and monuments. He enjoys this activity as it provides a unique opportunity to view Delphi with fresh eyes, to realize anew how astonishing this place must appear to people who do not live here day in and day out. This structure, he explains to a well-dressed merchant from Rhodes, pointing to a small but elegant treasury, was erected to commemorate the triumph at Marathon. The Athenians wished to express their gratitude to Apollo for his assistance in achieving victory over the Persians. In this regard, they dedicated 10% of all the spoils obtained during the battle to him. The merchant listens attentively and nods approvingly. Like the vast majority of Greeks, he is, of course, aware of the history of Marathon. However, the direct contemplation of the treasury itself, which carefully houses Persian gold and silver, lends this celebrated battle an added reality, making it more tangible and vivid. He shows the merchant the tripods won by victorious athletes at the Pythian Games, a grand festival in honor of Apollo, which every 4 years attracts participants from across the Mediterranean. He also points to the statue of Gelon of Syracuse, erected at his command after his triumph over the Carthaginians. The narrator explains in detail how the sacred way is designed to evoke a sense of ascent to the divine. Each new bend in the path reveals new wonders, while simultaneously heightening the anticipation of encountering the temple that majestically crowns the mountaintop. The merchant asks perceptive and thoughtful questions. He inquires about the process of selecting priests, the method of recording the oracle's prophecies, and the possibility for ordinary mortals like himself to consult Apollo. The narrator provides answers to the best of his ability, though it must be admitted that some aspects of the oracle's operations remain a strict secret to all but the most senior priests. What he is able to convey to the merchant is what it is like to reside daily in this sacred place. He describes how the morning light playing on the marble columns never grows old, never loses its novelty, how the melodic sounds of hymns echoing from the mountain peaks imbue even the most mundane tasks with deep meaning, and how the continuous stream of pilgrims arriving from all ends of the known world creates a sense that Delphi is the true center of the universe, that unique place where all the disparate threads of human existence converge. As the day steadily draws to a close, the mountain peaks begin to cast elongated shadows across the sacred precinct. Tourists gradually descend the mountain, heading to the town below in search of lodging. Meanwhile, the temple servants complete their daily duties and gather for the evening meal in the communal dining hall, cosily situated on the hillside just below the temple. The food offered, though simple, is of high quality. Freshly baked bread is served every morning. Cheese made from the milk of goats grazing on the mountain slopes. Olives and olive oil. Wine diluted with water according to ancient Greek custom. Meat from the morning sacrifice cooked over fragrant wood, and fresh fruits and vegetables brought from the fertile valleys. However, the true spiritual nourishment for those at the meal comes from the lively conversations held at the long wooden tables. Priests, scribes, and artisans exchange impressions and events of the past day. One mentions an exceptionally beautiful offering that arrived from distant Egypt. Another describes in detail a problem that has arisen with one of the treasury roofs, which will certainly require timely intervention before the winter rains. A young priest shares his research into ancient prophecies, seeking to identify certain patterns in Apollo's divine guidance manifested over the centuries. The communication here is never hurried or tense. There is something special about daily life in the sacred precinct that fosters greater thoughtfulness and mutual patience in people. Disagreements are resolved promptly and fairly, and gossip, if it arises, is exclusively harmless and good-natured. Everyone realizes that they are part of something much larger than themselves, something that will continue long after their earthly journey ends. As complete darkness enfolds the mountain, numerous oil lamps flicker throughout the sacred precinct. The temple columns begin to glow softly in their warm light, forming islands of illumination amidst the surrounding night. Characteristic night sounds begin to emerge, the distant bark of a fox, the soft hoot of an owl, and the wind gently whispers through the wild laurel trees growing on the mountainside. He makes a final inspection of the treasury, carefully checking the locks and ensuring all fastenings are secure for the night. After this, he ascends back up the hillside to his humble stone dwelling, carrying an oil lamp that illuminates his path along the familiar trail. Before falling asleep, he steps outside and gazes at the starry sky. Here, at the mountaintop, the celestial bodies seem significantly closer, brighter, and more numerous than ever in the valleys stretching below. On some nights, when the atmosphere is exceptionally clear and serene, he can almost imagine he hears music flowing from the celestial spheres. Perhaps it is Apollo's lyre playing melodies too perfect and beautiful for mortal ears. Tomorrow will bring another cycle of daily duties, a new stream of visitors and pilgrims, another opportunity to serve the God who transformed this mountain into the most sacred place in the ancient world. But tonight, as he drifts off to sleep, he experiences a deep sense of satisfaction, born of meaningful labor and the awareness of his belonging to something eternal and immeasurably important. Sometimes in his dreams he catches the voice of the oracle herself, that enigmatic priestess through whom Apollo speaks. When the deities choose to reveal the future to human minds, her pronouncements are invariably wise and true, though their true meaning is not always immediately clear. Her name never appeared in any official temple documents. None of the Pythias were mentioned by name in the sacred annals. They were known simply as Pythias, women who served as Apollo's voice, whose individual essence completely dissolved into their divine function. However, let us give her the name Clio, in honor of the muse of history, for her narrative deserves to be immortalized, even if her true name has vanished into the mists of time. Clio was chosen as Pythia when she was over 50 years old. Her hair was already touched with silver. Fine wrinkles lined her face, bearing witness to decades of accumulated wisdom and rich life experience. This selection was not a mere coincidence. For many centuries, Apollo's priests had become convinced that young women, no matter how sharp their intellect or outstanding their spiritual gifts, rarely possessed the inner strength and unwavering stability that were absolutely essential to serve as a conduit for the divine voice. To be an oracle meant not merely to receive divine inspiration. It required the ability to withstand the overwhelming power of a god's presence while maintaining clarity of mind and a sense of one's own individuality, acting as a channel for divine knowledge. Such a task demanded the deep, imperturbable calmness that typically comes only with age and accumulated experience. Clio was born in a humble village nestled at the foot of majestic Delphi. Her father was a potter whose skilled hands crafted simple clayware, so essential for the local farmers and shepherds. In her youth, she married a blacksmith, and in this union she bore 4 children. 2 of them, unfortunately, she had to mourn in infancy, a bitter fate that was sadly common in the ancient world. However, she saw 2 others reach maturity and start their own families. Throughout her life, Clio endured the harsh trials of wars and periods of famine, experienced both abundant and meagre harvests, and knew the ordinary joys and sorrows that, in essence, constitute the existence of most people. In difficult times she prayed to Apollo, and in periods of prosperity she offered him thanks. As repeatedly, year after year, she ascended the winding mountain path to Delphi, sometimes seeking divine guidance, and sometimes simply to join in the lavish festivities that united the entire region in common rejoicing. Meanwhile, far from her daily concerns, the priests of Delphi had been observing this woman for years, though she herself was unaware of it. Their attention did not miss how her fellow villagers invariably turned to her for wise counsel when communal disputes arose. They witnessed her imperturbable calm and deep thoughtfulness even in the most acute moments of crisis. The priests noted her profound, genuine piety. It was not a demonstrative, demanding religious fervour, craving dramatic signs and miracles, but rather a silent, unwavering faith, meekly trusting in divine wisdom, even when comprehending that wisdom seemed incredibly difficult. When the previous Pythia, who had served faithfully and well, peacefully passed away in her sleep at the venerable age of 73, the priests immersed themselves in long months of prayer and deliberation. They diligently sought Apollo's divine guidance as to who was worthy to occupy such a sacred place. The deity's answer came to them through a series of prophetic dreams and numerous omens, and all these signs, as if with one voice, pointed to the humble potter's daughter from the village nestled in the valley. Clio, upon learning of her destiny, experienced a range of emotions. She was deeply honoured, but simultaneously gripped by intense fear and utterly unprepared for the colossal changes and demands that awaited her in her new life. First and foremost, Clio had to undergo strict and profound rituals of purification. For 30 days she resided in a special house located within the sacred precinct, adhering to an ascetic diet consisting only of simple bread, cheese, water, and a small amount of diluted wine. Daily she performed ablutions in the crystal-clear waters of the sacred Castalian spring, washing away not only physical impurities, but, equally importantly, freeing herself from the accumulated attachments and worldly concerns of her former ordinary life. The priests diligently taught her ancient hymns and prayers that had been carefully passed down from one Pythia to another for generations. Some of these chants were so archaic that their language was barely recognizable as Greek. However, their melodies possessed an astonishing, almost mystical power, capable of altering states of consciousness and preparing the mind for the impending divine contact. Gradually, Clio mastered the art of discerning the sacred signs that unerringly indicated Apollo's readiness to utter his prophecies through her. These might be subtle rustlings of laurel leaves in absolutely still air, or unique patterns of steam rising from the sacred spring on certain days. She also learned to sense a special quality of light that seemed to thicken around the temple's inner sanctuary, announcing the god's presence. But the most difficult and at the same time the most important task was to learn to completely surrender her own will, her personal thoughts, desires and opinions, transforming herself into an empty vessel awaiting divine knowledge. This proved to be her greatest challenge. All her life, for 50 years, Clio had formed her individuality, developed her own way of thinking and made decisions based on her experience. Now she was required to set all of that aside, to become absolutely receptive to everything Apollo wished to convey through her. When the day of her first service as Oracle arrived, Clio was so profoundly agitated that she could barely take a few steps from the temple entrance to the sacred tripod, where she was to sit to receive divine inspiration. Her hands visibly trembled as she adjusted her snow-white robes, and her voice wavered treacherously during the opening prayers. The pilgrim who came for advice was a middle-aged farmer from Boeotia. His question was painfully simple and touching. His wife had been barren for 15 years of their marriage, and he ardently wished to know if Apollo could show him a path to having children. Clio carefully settled onto the three-legged bronze seat and closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her wildly beating heart and open her mind to the god's presence. For a long moment, nothing happened. A panicked feeling began to overwhelm her. Had Apollo made a mistake in his choice? Was she destined to fail utterly at the most crucial moment of her new life? And then, suddenly, the deity manifested itself. This sensation was not like possession by an alien spirit, as some ancient authors mistakenly asserted. Rather, it was akin to her becoming something more than herself, as if her consciousness expanded to encompass knowledge and perspectives that no mortal mind could normally grasp. In that moment, she sensed not only the farmer's profound affection for his wife and his growing despair, but also how their childlessness cast a dark shadow over their entire marriage. However, beyond the seeming simplicity of his question, she discerned deeper, genuine patterns of his fate. With divine clarity, she realized that his wife's barrenness was neither a curse nor the punishing hand of the gods, but merely one of those inexplicable sorrows that sometimes touch human lives. And she also saw that a child was already waiting for them, not born from his wife's body, but already existing in the world, needing loving parents. When Clio finally spoke, her voice sounded different even to herself. It was deeper, more resonant, filled with absolute and unwavering certainty. The child you seek is not the child you expect. Look beyond your own blood, and you will find a son who has patiently waited for your love. The farmer left, bewildered, yet also filled with new hope. 3 months later, he returned to offer thanks to Apollo. Misfortune had struck a neighbouring village. A plague epidemic had left many children orphaned. He and his wife adopted a 7-year-old boy whose parents had fallen victim to the disease. And from the moment they brought him into their home, their dwelling was filled with the joy they had sought in vain for so many years. Word of the successful prophecy spread rapidly throughout Hellas, as it always did when the oracle's guidance proved accurate and brought tangible benefit. More and more pilgrims began to undertake the arduous journey to Delphi, bringing with them questions of both profound philosophical significance and the most mundane, everyday concerns. Thus, one day a young man asked whether he should become a warrior or a merchant. Clio, uttering words in Apollo's voice, proclaimed to him that his greatest triumphs would come not through martial prowess or trade dealings, but through the power of words. He subsequently became one of Athens' most celebrated orators. Representatives of one city asked whether they should found a new colony across the sea. The oracle instructed them to seek a place where Apollo's ravens gathered in unusually large numbers. They found such a place on the coast of modern Turkey and established a thriving trading port there. Another mother brought her sick child and asked if the fever would subside. Apollo's answer was complex and metaphorical. The tree that bends in the storm survives while the mighty oak falls. The woman interpreted this as instruction to stop force-feeding her child and instead allow his body to rest and recover naturally. The fever receded within a few days. As the months passed, Clio became more deeply immersed in and accustomed to her sacred role as a herald of divine will. She learned to trust unconditionally the flow of divine knowledge that streamed through her, even if that knowledge sometimes contradicted her own human understanding of the situation. To manage this intense spiritual experience associated with transmitting Apollo's consciousness, she developed an entire system of methods. These included special breathing exercises, deep meditative practices, and particular ways of preparing her mind and body for the overwhelming presence of all-encompassing divine wisdom. However, she also understood that the oracle's role demanded more than simply receiving divine messages. It required the ability to translate these revelations into language accessible and practically applicable to ordinary people. Apollo's knowledge was boundless and timeless. He could foresee all possible developments, all consequences, all the interconnected patterns shaping human destiny. But mortal minds, by their nature, think in terms of linearity, concrete images, stories with clear beginnings and endings. Therefore, Clio learned to be not only a conduit, but also a skilled interpreter. When Apollo revealed vast, multifaceted truths about someone's future to her, she had to find ways to condense this comprehensive knowledge into concise, memorable phrases that could guide the questioner toward making wise decisions. At times, this meant uttering prophecies in the form of riddles and pregnant metaphors, requiring careful reflection to grasp their true meaning. The most celebrated oracles in history often seemed enigmatic, not because Apollo had a penchant for mystery, but because some truths were too grand and complex for direct, literal exposition. When the mighty King Croesus asked if he should undertake a campaign against the Persian Empire, Apollo revealed a vision to Clio. Vast armies clashing in battle, cities engulfed in flames, and an ancient kingdom reduced to ruins. But the deity also showed her that Croesus's question itself was fundamentally flawed. The king was interested in military strategy, whereas he should have inquired about wisdom, justice, and the proper use of his power. That is why the oracle's famous response was, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great kingdom." And Croesus, filled with overconfidence, interpreted this as a prediction that he would crush the Persian Empire. It was only after his complete defeat that he realized the true meaning of the prophecy. The great kingdom he destroyed was his own. The prophecy was absolutely accurate, but it also served as a harsh lesson in humility, a reminder that even powerful rulers must carefully consider their assumptions and hidden motives before taking actions that could affect the destinies of thousands. The oracle's service inevitably entailed profound solitude. Clio, as a conduit for Apollo's consciousness, was unable to freely disclose her prophetic visions. She was strictly forbidden from using divine knowledge for her own benefit or to assist her relatives and friends. Her duty was to maintain absolute impartiality and unwavering fairness, approaching the concerns of mighty kings and humble peasants with equal respect and attention. For her old acquaintances from the village below, it proved very difficult to accept this new, transformed role. How could one engage in ordinary conversation with someone who served as the voice of a deity? How could one complain about the whims of the weather, or gossip about neighbours with a woman who possessed direct access to unearthly wisdom? Thus Clio's closest bonds formed with other temple servants, the priests who meticulously prepared her for each prophetic session, the scribes who diligently recorded her predictions, and the attendants who guarded the sacred space of her activity. These individuals fully understood the weight of the burden she carried. They witnessed her complete exhaustion after each contact with the deity, observing how she sometimes required days to recover from the incredible spiritual intensity associated with transmitting divine consciousness. They honored her need for seclusion and deep repose, while at the same time showing her genuine care and providing comprehensive support. On days when she was not serving as Pythia, which was the vast majority of the time since prophecies were given only once a month, Clio led a secluded life within the sacred precinct. She cultivated a small garden where she grew herbs necessary for temple rituals. She also engaged in spinning wool and making cloth for the sanctuary's needs. Diligently, she analyzed the records of previous prophecies, searching for patterns that might help her more deeply understand Apollo's methods of interacting with mortals. Sometimes in the pre-dawn hours before the temple began to bustle with daily activity, she would sit on the steps of Apollo's sanctuary, gazing at the valley below. From this height, her gaze encompassed vast distances in all directions, olive groves and vineyards, tiny villages and wisps of smoke from hearths, and in the distance beyond a ridge of mountains the shimmering glints of the sea. This landscape invariably brought to mind the divine perspective. Thus Apollo could contemplate all human life, spread before him like a grand, multifaceted tapestry. Individual fates appeared as mere single threads in this tapestry, important certainly, but still components of something immeasurably vaster and more complex than any mortal could fully grasp. In these silent hours, Clio sometimes felt the invisible presence of the deity, even when she was not formally performing the direct duties of the oracle. It was not the overwhelming, transformative experience of prophecy, but rather a subtle perception of divine wisdom permeating the world. She felt Apollo's immense affection for humanity, his genuine desire to guide people toward making decisions that would ensure their well-being and happiness. She understood, through methods she could never fully express in words to others, that Apollo's prophecies were not random statements about a predetermined future. They represented guidance based on the logical results of human choices, wisdom intended to help people harmonize their actions with the fundamental laws of justice and harmony that govern the universe. Thus, the oracle was not a pronouncement of fate in the sense that we might perceive it in a modern context. In essence, it was spiritual guidance conducted at the highest possible level, divine wisdom directed at solving human problems, boundless erudition refracted through perfect compassion. Decades passed. Cleo's hair turned completely silver, and wrinkles deepened around her eyes. But these were not marks of anxiety or sorrow, but of life experience and deep serenity. In her role, she achieved a peace of mind she had never known in her previous life, a sense of absolute alignment with her true purpose. Each month, new pilgrims flocked, bringing with them the same eternal questions that people have always asked. Will I be happy? Will I succeed? Should I marry this person? Should I move to that place? How can I know what the gods want from me? And month after month, Cleo yielded to Apollo's wisdom, uttering answers that pointed these supplicants toward optimal decisions, expanded awareness, and a more meaningful existence. In her normal human mind, she never knew how effective the advice, uttered by her through Apollo, turned out to be. Pilgrims, having received prophecies, would immediately leave Delphi, returning to their distant homes to grasp the meaning of the deity's words through personal experience. However, sometimes, many years later, someone would return to Delphi to make an offering of gratitude to Apollo. This might be a successful merchant who started his business based on the oracle's advice, or a prosperous wife who chose a husband according to divine instruction, or an entire city saved from disaster by heeding the gods' warnings. All these return visits were an immeasurable joy in Cleo's life as Pythia. They affirmed what she had always sincerely believed but could never find factual confirmation for, that Apollo's love for humanity is genuine, that divine wisdom truly can help mortals navigate the complexities of earthly existence, and that her own role as the voice of the deity was truly significant. However, even more significant than the successful prophecies were the lessons she learned about the very essence of divine guidance. Apollo never made decisions for people. He never provided simple or convenient outcomes. Instead, he helped people to clarify their alternatives, to foresee more accurately the probable consequences of their actions, and to harmonize their decisions with fundamental principles of prudence and righteousness that would benefit them regardless of external factors. The god, speaking through Cleo, instructed people to formulate deeper questions rather than simply giving them the answers they believed they wanted to receive. He stimulated them to reflect more deeply on their motives and values. He helped them cultivate the inner foresight that would serve them throughout their lives, and not just in the immediate problem that brought them to Delphi. And gradually, over her years of service as an oracle, Cleo realized that this was precisely how divine guidance should function, not as a miraculous solution to human problems, but as a method of assisting people in becoming more discerning, more insightful, and more skilled in making decisions that would ensure their true well-being and self-actualization. Upon reaching the age of 70, Cleo felt Apollo's presence begin to gradually fade within her. It did not happen all at once, but steadily, like the slow ebb of the sea. She knew that her era as oracle was drawing to a close, and she was ready to accept this transition. Her final prediction was given to a young woman who asked a question Clio herself might have formulated many years ago. How can I live a life that matters? Apollo's answer, uttered through the aging Pythia, was concise and comprehensive. Listen keenly, speak truth, make wise choices, love with all your heart. The gods require nothing more. 3 months later, Clio peacefully passed away in her sleep, much like her predecessor. The priests found her in her humble abode within the temple precinct. Her face was serene, and her hands rested on a scroll containing one of Apollo's ancient hymns. She was laid to rest with due honours in the sacred necropolis located on the mountainside above Delphi, her resting place marked by a simple stone that identified her only as Pythia, a devoted servant of Apollo. Her personal name was never immortalized, according to her will. However, her legacy lived on in the wisdom she transmitted, in the guidance she provided, in the lives she helped improve through her performance as the voice of the deity. And in the silent pre-dawn hours, when the mountain mist swirled around the temple columns, and the first light illuminated the sacred peaks, the priests sometimes imagined they could still hear her voice, low and resonant, filled with unearthly power, uttering truths that would outlast centuries, long after marble turned to dust and bronze acquired a patina. But who were these people who ascended this peak in search of such insight? What motivated ordinary mortals to undertake the arduous journey to Apollo's sacred sanctuary? Let us follow some of them along the winding road and listen to the questions that so heavily weighed upon their souls. A messenger arrived in Delphi 3 days before King Croesus himself, bearing offerings so lavish that even Apollo's servants, people accustomed to receiving gifts from the wealthiest individuals in the ancient world, interrupted their daily routines to gaze in astonishment. First came a life-sized golden lion, flawlessly crafted. Its mane was exquisitely detailed, so that each strand seemed to catch the morning light. The lion weighed almost 500 pounds of pure gold, and it took 12 men to carry it up the sacred way to Apollo's temple. Then followed mixing craters of gold and silver, each so large that a man could immerse himself in it, their surfaces decorated with intricate scenes depicting gods and heroes. There were also golden cups and silver amphorae, bronze tripods with serpent-shaped supports, and ivory statues created by the greatest masters of the era. Among all the offerings, a monolithic golden altar stood out, destined to adorn Apollo's sanctuary forever. Its surface gleamed with inlays of precious stones brought from the farthest reaches of the inhabited world, and prayers were inscribed upon it in numerous languages. The temple servants meticulously recorded every detail of this offering, entering its exact weight, dimensions, and finest artistic features into the temple's eternal annals. However, quiet whispers circulated among them regarding the true meaning of these unprecedented gifts, for as their many years of service suggested, the most generous and lavish offerings usually heralded the deepest and most fateful inquiries. Their premonitions proved correct. When King Croesus of Lydia, accompanied by a numerous retinue of nobles, servants, and bodyguards, finally reached sacred Delphi, his question, seemingly simple, held the potential for catastrophic changes capable of completely redrawing the map of the ancient world. Should I wage war against the Persian Empire? To fully grasp the colossal significance of this question, One must mentally transport oneself to the political landscape of the ancient world as it was around 550 BCE. For many centuries, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean region had remained relatively stable. The Greek city-states firmly held control over island territories and vast coastal areas. Numerous kingdoms, among which Lydia stood out, governed the inland regions of what is now Turkey. The Egyptian Empire maintained its dominant position on the southern borders, and far to the east the Persian Empire was rapidly gaining power and influence, though its attention had not yet seriously turned to westward expansion. King Croesus ruled the Lydian state, whose capital, Sardis, was located in what is now western Turkey. Lydia was renowned for its untold wealth, so colossal that even today the expression rich as Croesus serves to describe a person possessing virtually limitless financial resources. This prosperous kingdom controlled key trade routes connecting Europe and Asia, and its rivers concealed deposits of gold, which Lydian jewelers and craftsmen had learned to handle with truly unsurpassed skill. However, as Croesus gradually realized, wealth could be not only a blessing but also a heavy burden. With each new success, his state increasingly attracted the gaze of ambitious neighbors eager to seize Lydian treasures. The Persian Empire, led by its energetic and young ruler Cyrus, steadily advanced westward. The Persians had already subjugated Media and Babylon, thereby adding the wealth and military forces of these kingdoms to their own, constantly growing power. Soon, Lydian sentinels began to report the appearance of Persian scouts on Lydia's eastern borders, and diplomatic dispatches from the Persian court grew increasingly ultimatums and demanding. Croesus faced a truly terrifying dilemma. If he waited for Persia to strike first, he would have to fight a defensive war on his own soil, which would inevitably lead to untold destruction for his people and cities. However, if he decided on a preemptive strike, he would engage in conflict with an enemy whose true strength remained a mystery, risking the fate of his entire kingdom in a single military campaign. Either decision threatened inevitable catastrophe. In this desperate situation, Croesus decided to act as powerful Greeks had for generations when faced with intractable problems. He turned to Apollo, seeking divine guidance. However, Croesus was not only immensely wealthy but also exceedingly prudent. Before entrusting the fate of his state to the oracle's words, he deemed it necessary to verify the veracity of the divine prophecy. Therefore, he dispatched messengers to 7 different oracles scattered throughout the ancient world, to Delphi, to Dodona, to the oracle of Ammon in Libya, and to a number of other sacred sites. They were instructed to ask each prophet the exact same question on a strictly appointed day. What exactly is King Croesus doing at this very moment? At the same time, Croesus himself spent that day engaged in an activity so extraordinary and highly specific that no mortal could possibly have guessed what he was doing. He took a young lamb and a tortoise, butchered them, and boiled them together in a bronze cauldron, covered with a bronze lid, in a secluded corner of his private courtyard, where no one could observe him. When the messengers returned, bringing answers from various oracles, only one of them was able to describe Croesus's unusual actions with absolute accuracy. The Delphic Oracle, through Apollo's priestess, proclaimed, "I know the number of grains of sand on the shore and the depth of the sea. I understand the speech of the silent and hear the mute. The smell of hard-shelled tortoise, boiling and bubbling with lamb's flesh in a bronze cauldron, bronze below and a bronze lid covering it, reached my nostrils. The impeccable accuracy of this prophecy utterly convinced Croesus that Apollo was indeed capable of seeing over vast distances and perceiving hidden things inaccessible to mortal sight. After this, he immediately sent his lavish gifts to Delphi and prepared to pose the very question that would decide the fate of his state. When the long-awaited answer from the oracle came, it seemed remarkably encouraging to the king. If Croesus crosses the Halys River, he will destroy a great kingdom. The Halys River served as the natural boundary between Lydia and the Persian Empire. Croesus interpreted this prediction as a direct indication that if he invaded Persian lands, he would crush Cyrus's mighty kingdom and forever ensure Lydia's safety. However, it should be remembered that Apollo's prophecies were always renowned for their ambiguity and required extremely careful interpretation. The deity's words were always technically impeccable, but their meaning did not always coincide with the expectations of the questioners. Emboldened by what he perceived as unequivocal divine approval of his belligerent designs, Croesus immediately began preparations for the largest military campaign in Lydia's history. He forged strategic alliances with Sparta and Egypt, which was intended to force Persia to fight on several fronts simultaneously. He recruited thousands of mercenaries to significantly augment his own troops. The king amassed weapons, provisions, and siege engines, sparing no expense, so that his army would be equipped in the best possible way. These preparations took almost an entire year. Throughout this period, messengers constantly travelled between Sardis and the capitals of Croesus's allied states, coordinating the overall strategy and timing of impending actions. Streams of Lydian gold were generously spent on paying for ships and soldiers, horses and chariots, and on ensuring the colossal logistical operation necessary for transporting and supplying a huge army in enemy territory. Finally, with the arrival of spring in 547 BCE, Croesus, at the head of his army, crossed the Halys River, invading Persian lands. The initial phase of the campaign was successful. The Lydian legions managed to capture several border towns and won a number of minor victories over Persian vanguard units. For several weeks it seemed as if Apollo's prophecy was being fulfilled exactly as Croesus desired. However, then King Cyrus himself arrived on the battlefield, leading the main forces of the Persian army. The two mighty hosts clashed on the plain near the ancient city of Thyra, located in central modern Turkey. The battle was bloody and lasted all day, inflicting enormous losses on both sides. When night fell, ending the battle, neither army had achieved a decisive victory. Croesus, realizing that the Persians were significantly stronger than he had anticipated, decided to retreat to Sardis for winter quarters. His strategic plan was to use the cold months to attract new allies and gather additional reinforcements, and then resume military operations in the spring when weather conditions became more favorable. Such a strategy seemed entirely reasonable, a model of the meticulous military planning that had ensured Lydia's prosperity for many years. However, Croesus fatally underestimated his opponent. Instead of withdrawing to winter quarters like most ancient armies, Cyrus pursued the retreating Lydian forces with relentless speed and astonishing efficiency. The Persian army reached the walls of Sardis just as Croesus was still organizing defensive measures. The siege began immediately, and after just 14 days, Persian warriors managed to find a way to breach the seemingly impregnable walls of the Lydian capital. Croesus was captured within the walls of his own palace. His once mighty army was either completely destroyed or scattered. The treasures accumulated by generations of Lydian rulers were loaded onto Persian caravans, and the kingdom of Lydia, one of the wealthiest and most influential powers of the ancient world, ceased to exist. Apollo's prophecy came true with astonishing and truly devastating accuracy. Croesus indeed crossed the Halys River, and he indeed destroyed a great kingdom, but that great kingdom proved to be his own realm. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who recorded these events approximately half a century after their occurrence, Croesus was initially condemned to a torturous death, being burned alive as a sacrifice to Persian deities. However, as he stood on the funeral pyre, awaiting the flames to ignite, he suddenly recalled another wise piece of advice he had once received from a Greek philosopher. Many years before the start of this war, a wise man named Solon visited Croesus's royal court. The king, with undisguised pride, showed his guest all his untold wealth and boundless power. Then he turned to Solon and asked him whom he considered the happiest man on earth. Croesus evidently believed that he himself would be named as such. But Solon disagreed, stating that no one could be called truly happy until their earthly journey was complete. For fortune, like the wind, can change at any moment. Even the wealthiest and most influential of mortals can face unimaginable catastrophe before their last breath, and only a life that has ended well can be considered truly successful. Standing on the Persian funeral pyre face to face with his inevitable demise, Croesus finally grasped the profound meaning of what Solon had tried in vain to teach him. He cried out the philosopher's name 3 times, Solon, Solon, Solon. Cyrus, hearing these cries, demanded an explanation. When Croesus recounted Solon's wisdom to him, the Persian ruler was so deeply impressed that he immediately ordered the execution to be halted. Instead of taking the life of his defeated adversary, Cyrus appointed Croesus as one of his advisors, highly valuing the fallen king's hard-won understanding of the capriciousness of fate. But Croesus, despite his fall, did not put an end to his relationship with Apollo. As soon as he managed to establish himself at Cyrus's court and regain some influence, he again sent an embassy to Delphi. This time, instead of the usual rich gifts, he sent an angry complaint. How could Apollo have so cruelly deceived him? How did the god accept his generous offerings and then give him a prediction that led to the complete collapse of his kingdom? The oracle's answer, as always, was profound in meaning, but completely devoid of sympathy. Apollo saved Croesus from the fate he essentially deserved. The god delayed this fate for 3 whole years out of his favor, though Croesus never realized it. Moreover, Croesus did not formulate the correct question. He should have asked if he should wage war at all, not whether he should wage war specifically against Persia. And if he was uncertain about the interpretation of the prophecy, he should have sent messengers for further clarification. In other words, Apollo provided Croesus with exactly what he asked for: accurate information about the potential consequences of his planned actions. However, the god was not responsible for Croesus's assumptions, his failure to ask clarifying questions, or his decision to interpret the divine guidance in a way that merely confirmed his own desires, instead of questioning them. The story of Croesus became one of the most famous cautionary tales in the ancient world. It was told and retold as a vivid example of how even divine wisdom can be misinterpreted by mortals who approach it with the wrong attitude and inflated expectations. But this story also serves as an important illustration of how the Delphic Oracle actually functioned. Apollo's prophecies were not intended to make decisions for people or guarantee successful outcomes. Instead, they were designed to help people clarify their choices and their true motives. If Croesus had approached the oracle with a genuine willingness to accept any guidance, if he had been prepared to consider the possibility that war might not be the best solution to his problems, Apollo's enigmatic answer might have prompted him to seek diplomatic alternatives, to find creative solutions that could have preserved both his kingdom and regional peace. But Croesus arrived in Delphi with a decision already made. He craved divine approval for a choice already committed, not genuine guidance on whether that choice was wise. So Apollo granted him a prophecy that was technically accurate, but did not prevent him from making the mistake he was determined to make. The god respected human free will too much to override it, even when he could foresee that someone's choice would lead to catastrophe. This understanding of divine guidance, that it illuminates options and consequences rather than controls outcomes, became central to how the oracle operated throughout its long history. Kings and commoners alike learned that Apollo's wisdom was most useful to those who approached it with genuine humility and openness to unexpected answers. The story of Croesus also solidified Delphi's reputation as an authoritative source of political prophecies. Throughout the ancient world, word spread that Apollo could see the rise and fall of kingdom, the outcomes of wars, the long-term consequences of political decisions. This reputation attracted more and more rulers to Delphi in search of guidance, making the oracle one of the most influential institutions in ancient politics. However, not all these royal consultations ended in disaster. Many kings and queens learned to ask more precise questions than Croesus, approaching divine wisdom with the humility and careful deliberation that such wisdom demanded. The oracle guided the founding of colonies, the forging of alliances, the establishment of laws, and countless other political decisions that shaped the development of Greek civilization. And in most cases, rulers who followed Apollo's guidance with genuine wisdom and flexibility found that it led them to justice, prosperity, and a kind of success that could withstand the inevitable shifts of fate. But the oracle's influence extended far beyond the decisions of kings and queens. Ordinary people, farmers and merchants, soldiers and artisans, also ascended the mountain path to Delphi, carrying their questions and their hopes for divine guidance. Their stories were less dramatic than the fall of kingdoms, but no less important to the people who lived them. The old farmer's hands tremble slightly as he unwraps his offering. It is a small bronze bull figurine, no bigger than his thumb. It was carefully crafted by the village blacksmith and polished to a gleam, like gold, in the dim light of the temple. It represented months of savings. Coins put aside from the sale of barley and olives, copper coins accumulated through frugality in everything from lamp oil to winter clothes. His name is Apollodorus, meaning gift of Apollo, and he has walked 4 days from his small farm in Boeotia to reach this sacred mountain. His feet are calloused. His simple woolen tunic is dusty from the road. And he carries the scent of honest labour, of earth and sweat, and the lingering smell of the barn where he tends his few animals. He looks incredibly out of place among the marble columns and golden treasuries. This weathered man, whose hands are forever stained with soil, and whose vocabulary contains more words for different kinds of fertilizer than for philosophical concepts. But Apollo's priests treat him with the same respectful attention as they would kings and wealthy merchants, because the oracle does not distinguish between rich and poor when it comes to human needs. Apollodorus's question is simple, but it weighs on him like a stone in his chest. His youngest son, barely 16, wants to leave the farm and seek his fortune in Athens. The boy is clever and ambitious, chafing at the quiet rhythms of agricultural life, dreaming of becoming a merchant or perhaps even a politician in the great city. But if the boy leaves, who will help with the harvest? Who will care for Apollodorus and his wife when they become too old to work? The farm has been in their family for 5 generations. Must it die with them because their son seeks another life? The farmer has spent sleepless nights wrestling with this dilemma. He loves his son and wants him to be happy, but he also fears losing everything his ancestors built, fears spending his last years in poverty because he was too generous to keep the help he needed. When Apollodorus finally kneels before the Pythia and whispers his question, his voice trembles with emotion. Should I allow my son to leave for Athens, or should I keep him on the farm where he belongs? The oracle's answer comes in the form of a gentle riddle. The seed that remains in the granary never grows, but the seed that falls on rocky ground quickly dies. Seek the middle way, a field that is neither too safe nor too dangerous. Apollodorus leaves Delphi more confused than enlightened. What does Apollo mean by the middle way? How can there be a compromise between staying and leaving? But as he walks home, pondering the god's words deeply, understanding slowly comes. Perhaps he does not have to choose between keeping his son forever and losing him completely. Perhaps there is a way for the boy to explore opportunities in Athens while still maintaining a connection to the family farm. When Apollodorus returns home, he proposes a plan to his son. The boy can spend the winter months in Athens, learning trade and city life, working for one of their distant relatives who has a small business there. But he will return each spring for planting and each autumn for harvest, bringing his urban knowledge to help improve the farm's operations. It is not the complete freedom the boy dreamed of, nor the security the father hoped for, but it works. The son gains valuable skills in Athens and eventually opens a business importing wine to the city, while also introducing new agricultural methods to the family farm. Both father and son prosper, and the farm continues into the next generation, enriched rather than abandoned. Apollo's guidance helped them find a creative solution that neither of them could have imagined on their own. Not far behind Apollodorus on the mountain path walks a young soldier named Lysander, his bronze armour polished but already dented after his first campaign. He is barely 20, with the nervous energy that comes from surviving battles that killed many of his friends. Lysander fought at Marathon 5 years ago, standing in the phalanx when the Greeks won their incredible victory over the invading Persians. He felt the exhilaration of triumph, the pride of having served his city well, the deep satisfaction of defending everything he loved from foreign domination. But he also saw things that haunt his dreams. The moment his best friend took a Persian spear to the chest and died, calling for his mother, the aftermath of battle, as Greek soldiers walked among the wounded enemies, deciding who would live and who would die. the way victory celebrations felt hollow when he remembered the faces of the men who would not return home. Now Athens was preparing for another military campaign. This time their target would be former allies in the Delian League who had refused to pay the tribute that funded the mighty Athenian fleet. Lysander had been chosen for promotion to a military leadership position, an honour most young men would accept with jubilant enthusiasm. However, Lysander himself harboured deep doubts about his future as a warrior. The former allure of military glory had lost its edge since he turned 18, and his hands remained clean of blood, unstained by the horrors of battle. He began to ponder other ways to serve his polis, perhaps as a teacher, or as an administrator in the burgeoning Athenian Empire, or even choosing the path of a merchant whose profits could contribute to public projects and festive celebrations. His question to the oracle was deeply personal and intimate. I have served as a soldier, but the experience of war has revealed aspects of existence that I sincerely wish to forget. Should I remain in military service, or should I choose a completely different path in life? The Pythia's answer was, as often, full of deep, multifaceted meaning. The blade that always remains in its scabbard inevitably rusts, but the one constantly used in battle loses its sharpness. True honour requires not only might, but also insight, wisdom. Serve your polis in a way that safeguards and preserves what you are called to protect. Lysander spent long days and nights deeply pondering these words. What was the true meaning of service that aimed to preserve what was under his protection? How could he honour his accumulated military experience while adhering to the growing conviction that the use of violence should be a last, not a first resort? In the end, he found a solution to his dilemma in a direction he had not at all expected. Athens desperately needed experienced warriors capable of imparting necessary military skills to the city's youth. But equally important were instructors who could instill in young people an understanding of the profound moral obligations associated with the potential use of force. Lysander accepted a position as an instructor in one of the gymnasiums, teaching not only the art of wielding weapons and the intricacies of battle tactics, but also the philosophical principles that should guide every decision of a true warrior. His students learned to fight skillfully, but they also learned to thoughtfully analyze when battle was an unavoidable necessity and when it could and should be avoided. They acquired physical valor to meet enemies in combat, but also the moral courage to question orders that might bring dishonor upon their native polis. Years later, when these students became prominent Athenian generals, they began to make decisions that harmoniously combined both might and deep wisdom. They achieved victories in necessary conflicts with greater efficiency and avoided unnecessary clashes with greater consistency. Thus, Apollo's wise counsel, refracted through Lysander's personal experience and pedagogical activity, had a profound and lasting impact on Athenian military strategy for an entire generation. Following Lysander up the winding mountain path ascended a middle-aged woman named Penelope, accompanied by her teenage daughter Melanippe. Both wore modest but well-made clothes, clearly indicating their membership in a respected merchant class, affluent enough to afford a pilgrimage to Delphi, but not so wealthy as to indulge in ostentatious luxury on the journey. Penelope was a widow. Her husband had passed away 3 years prior, leaving her a modest but quite profitable business importing textiles from Egypt and selling them in the bustling markets of Corinth. She had managed this enterprise with admirable success, proving to her sometimes skeptical male competitors that a woman could be just as adept at understanding trade routes, negotiating complex contracts and effectively managing her employees as any man. But now her daughter had reached the age when she should marry, and Penelope faced an important decision that could determine their shared future. Several worthy men had already sought Melanippus' hand, among them one whose proposal promised particular benefit for their family business. This man owned his own ships, which could significantly expand Penelope's trading operations, and his extensive connections in Alexandria could open new, promising markets for her products. However, Melanippe felt no affection for this very practical suitor. Her heart leaned towards a young philosopher who possessed neither wealth nor the slightest interest in commerce, but whose conversations about ethics, aesthetics, and the deep nature of truth made her eyes sparkle with intellectual delight and inspiration. Penelope knew perfectly well what most mothers would do in such a situation: arrange a financially advantageous marriage, guarantee her daughter's financial stability, facilitate the expansion of the family business, and hope that, with time, affection would surely develop between spouses bound by practical considerations. Such a choice seemed entirely reasonable, one that most fellow citizens would consider not merely prudent, but the only correct one. However, Penelope could not forget her own marriage experience. Her husband had once been chosen by her father based solely on pragmatic considerations, and although a genuine affection did eventually blossom between them, she invariably wondered what it would have been like to unite her destiny with someone who truly understood her deepest thoughts and cherished dreams. Therefore, her appeal to the oracle was imbued with both deeply personal feelings and pragmatic considerations. Should my daughter marry according to her heart's desire, or by cold calculation? How should a mother choose between her child's true happiness and her secure safety? Apollo's answer, uttered through the Pythia, came in words that seemed addressed to both women at once. A foundation resting on sincere affection can bear far greater weight than one built solely on gold. Yet affection without practical wisdom builds houses that crumble in the first storm. Seek a union that honors both the heart and the mind equally. Mother and daughter left Delphi, carrying with them many questions and topics for thorough discussion. The oracle did not directly tell them which path to choose, but provided a solid basis for deeper and clearer consideration of all available options. Over the subsequent months, they spent long evenings discussing what kind of life Melanippe truly wished to build for herself. Young Melanippe realized that, despite all her affection for the philosopher's mind, she also highly valued the independence and sense of security that a successful commercial enterprise provided. She did not wish to worry about financial matters her entire life, even for the sake of the most elevated intellectual exchange. Meanwhile, Penelope gradually came to understand that her daughter's true happiness was significantly more important than merely expanding the business. She was quite capable of maintaining and even developing her current trade operations without concluding a particularly advantageous marriage. What she could not replace was the opportunity for Melanippe to find a genuine partnership with a man who would value her intellect as highly as her outward beauty. The decision they ultimately reached proved unexpected for many. Melanippe married the philosopher, but at the same time became an active participant and partner in her mother's commercial enterprise. Her newly minted husband, as it turned out, possessed a considerable talent for the mathematical calculations necessary for currency exchange operations and drafting shipping schedules. Thus, the young couple brought both intellectual sophistication and highly valuable practical skills to the family business. Under their joint leadership, the enterprise began to flourish, expanding into new markets and implementing innovative approaches in the fields of credit and banking, which made them not only wealthy, but also truly happy, and their marriage transformed into one of those rare partnerships where business cooperation did not displace, but rather deepened and enriched romantic love. These narratives of the farmer who found a golden mean, of the warrior who chose the path of a teacher, of the mother and daughter who rejected a false choice imposed by circumstances, represent but a small fraction of the thousands of similar appeals that, over many centuries, brought ordinary people to sacred Delphi. Most of these everyday prophecies, unfortunately, were never recorded in official temple archives. The oracle's guidance addressed to kings and queens was meticulously preserved, for it concerned the fates of entire nations. However, advice given to farmers, merchants, and young mothers was deemed too personal and specific to possess broader historical significance. However, it was precisely these mundane consultations that largely constituted the very essence of what lent Delphi its true sacredness. They vividly demonstrated that divine wisdom was accessible to everyone who approached it, with sincere need and with honest, open questions. They indicated that the gods cared about individual human well-being, and not exclusively about the rises and falls of great empires. The oracle's answers addressed to ordinary mortals also revealed certain patterns that today help us more deeply understand how the ancient Greeks conceptualized the fundamental questions of existence. Apollo invariably encouraged people to seek creative alternatives to dichotomous either-or choices. He guided them toward developing solutions that simultaneously considered a multitude of values, from tradition to innovation, from security to the pursuit of growth, from personal desires to family responsibilities. The deity's wisdom invariably emphasized the need for balance and long-term strategic thinking. It helped people to consider not only the immediate consequences of their actions, but also how their choices would affect their descendants and the well-being of their communities. The god encouraged them to develop virtues such as courage, insight, and justice, but always in a way that these virtues remained practically applicable and achievable in their specific life circumstances. Perhaps the most important aspect of Apollo's guidance for ordinary people was that it demonstrated that the pursuit of divine wisdom by no means implied an evasion of personal responsibility for one's own choices. The deity never made decisions for people. Instead, he helped them to think more clearly about their possibilities, to view their situations from a new, broader perspective, and to develop the inner resources that were necessary for making wise decisions and living with the consequences of those choices. The farmer who allowed his son to explore Athens while preserving unbroken family ties. The warrior who found a path of service balancing both strength and peace. The mother who helped her daughter choose love without sacrificing her security. All of them had to carefully work out the practical aspects of implementing the guidance received from Apollo. The deity granted wisdom and broad perspective, but the people themselves had to demonstrate the courage and ingenuity so necessary for building a better life. this cooperative relationship between divine guidance and human responsibility became one of the defining features of Greek religion in its most elevated manifestation. The gods appeared not as distant rulers uttering arbitrary commands, but as wise counselors called upon to help mortals develop their own capacity for sound judgment and decision-making. And this gift of discernment was tested not only in life's grand vicissitudes, but also in the countless everyday choices that, in essence, determine whether one's existence is rich and fulfilling, or conversely, full of disappointments, whether interpersonal bonds strengthen or gradually fade, whether their work serves the good of society or undermines its foundations. The oracle at Delphi perfectly understood that the ordinary problems of common people were just as significant as the state upheavals that brought kings in search of higher guidance. A farmer's decision regarding his son's future might seem insignificant compared to questions of war and peace, yet that decision had a direct and far-reaching impact on real lives. Therefore, Apollo spoke to all who ascended the sacred mountain with genuine questions and open hearts. His wisdom was open to anyone willing to listen thoughtfully and reflect deeply on what they heard. And for centuries, this accessibility of higher guidance contributed to the formation of a culture that valued both earthly insight and elevated spiritual quests, both personal self-discovery and civic responsibility. But how did these mysterious prophecies of the oracle actually work? What happened when the Pythia entered a trance state and uttered words that seemed to come from beyond human comprehension, beyond ordinary knowledge? The answer to these questions involves some of the most extraordinary phenomena ever recorded at any sacred site in the ancient world. Deep beneath Apollo's temple, in the profound fissures and hidden caves that extend into the depths of the Parnassus mountain range, the rock itself is the source of extraordinary phenomena. Water penetrates through porous limestone, formed in times when this land was covered by ancient seas. This water, heated by the gradual warmth of geological transformations, rises back to the surface, carrying with it dissolved minerals and gaseous compounds from depths no living creature's foot or paw has ever trod. Most of these subterranean emissions are harmless, simply steam and carbon dioxide, typical byproducts of water interacting with rock under high pressure and temperature. But some of the gases are of a rarer nature, created by chemical reactions that occur exclusively in peculiar geological circumstances. The oracle chamber was located directly above one of the most potent of these subterranean vents. For over 1,000 years, visitors to Delphi reported extraordinary phenomena surrounding the Pythia's prophecies. Fragrant, slightly sweet vapors rising from fissures in the temple floor, an intoxicating scent that seemed to induce altered states of mind in anyone who inhaled it deeply. Eyewitnesses described how the oracle herself would fall into such a deep trance that she seemed to transform into an entirely different person, speaking in a voice that they attested was strikingly different from her usual manner of speech. Ancient writers meticulously detailed these phenomena. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi in the 1st century AD, wrote about the mysterious pneuma, a breath or spirit that rose from the earth and filled the oracle's inner chamber during prophetic sessions. He described how the vapors had a peculiar but pleasant aroma, and how inhaling them seemed to induce a state of divine enlightenment. Other classical authors wrote about a sacred fissure in the temple floor, the adaton, or Holy of Holies, access to which was permitted exclusively to the Pythia. They described how she sat on her bronze tripod directly above this crack in the earth, inhaling the vapours rising from the depths of the earth, while awaiting Apollo's wisdom to permeate her mind. For many centuries, the scientific community held the view that these ancient descriptions were purely mythological fiction. The idea that geological processes could produce gases capable of altering states of consciousness seemed too convenient, too rational an interpretation of what was, undoubtedly, a spiritual phenomenon. When archaeologists began excavating Delphi in the late 19th century, they found no evidence of fissures or gas vents, which seemed to definitively confirm that ancient narratives were nothing more than religious legends. But in the 1990s, a team of scientists revisited the geological structure beneath Delphi, employing advanced techniques unavailable to previous generations of researchers. Their discoveries proved truly remarkable. Apollo's temple is situated at the junction of two significant geological faults, cracks in the Earth's crust where deep pressure creates precisely the conditions that can foster unusual chemical reactions. These faults remain active to this day, periodically triggering minor seismic tremors, which has always been a common phenomenon in this area. More importantly, the particular type of limestone bedrock beneath Delphi contains bituminous deposits, organic remnants of ancient marine flora and fauna that, under the influence of geothermal heating, can produce ethylene gas. Ethylene is a fragrant, slightly sweet chemical compound that, in small concentrations, induces a mild euphoric effect. In larger concentrations, it can provoke hallucinatory visions and profound alterations in states of consciousness. The scientific team managed to identify microscopic traces of ethylene in the spring waters near the temple, convincingly demonstrating that this gaseous substance continues to be generated by geological processes beneath Delphi. They also found evidence that concentrations would have been significantly higher in ancient times, when the fault systems were more active and the deep cavities were less affected by seismic activity and anthropogenic interventions, such as excavations. This discovery in no way diminishes the sacred significance of the oracle's prophecies, but it sheds light on the mechanism by which the Pythia could enter the profound trance states, so vividly depicted by ancient eyewitnesses. One can imagine the oracle seated on her bronze tripod in the inner sanctuary of Apollo's temple. The room is small and dimly lit, light coming only from oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across the stone walls. Beneath her feet, a faint rumble of water moving through deep, subterranean channels can be heard, a delicate whisper that seems to echo her own breathing. She has prepared for this sacred moment for many days through meticulous rituals of purification. She has fasted until her body has become light and almost intangible. She has bathed in the sacred springs until her skin seemed to glow with an inner light. She has devoted herself to prayers and meditations until her mind was free of all personal thoughts and worldly desires, completely open to receiving any divine wisdom that might fill it. Now she breathes deeply, filling her lungs with the temple's atmosphere. The air has a peculiar sweetness, reminiscent of honey mixed with floral aromas, unlike any scent she has ever encountered in the ordinary world. As she continues to breathe, this sweetness seems to spread throughout her body, creating a sensation of warmth and weightlessness that makes her feel as though she is floating above her own physical form. Her consciousness begins to shift, The boundaries between herself and the surrounding world blur. She senses the presence of the pilgrim waiting outside the chamber. His anxiety and hope emanate like heat from a fire. She feels the focused attention of the priests and temple servants. Their concentrated focus intensifies the spiritual tension of the moment, and then gradually she becomes aware of something colossal and radiant touching the edges of her mind. Not Apollo himself. Deities do not appear to mortals in the full splendor of their divine glory, but something like a shadow or an echo of a higher consciousness, filtered through veils of mystery until it becomes something a human mind can perceive without being utterly destroyed. Knowledge begins to flow through her, knowledge that is not her own. She grasps details of the pilgrim's life and circumstances that no one has told her. She sees interconnections and potential possibilities that her ordinary mind could never comprehend. She understands the intricate web of cause and effect that will shape this individual's future, depending on the decisions they make in response to higher guidance. When she begins to speak, the words that pour from her lips astonish her as much as they do the listeners. It is her voice, but not her thoughts, her language, but not her personal knowledge. She hears herself utter prophecies that are at once profound and pragmatic, enigmatic and clear, mystical and perfectly adapted to resolving the true questions hidden beneath what the pilgrim believes he is asking. This is what was made possible by a combination of spiritual self-refinement and mild chemical influence for the oracle at Delphi. The ethylene vapours were not the source of the prophecies themselves. They merely facilitated the Pythia in reaching a state of consciousness where divine illumination could occur. It is essential to realize that the ancient Greeks would have seen no contradiction between natural and transcendent explanations for the priestess's abilities. They believed that deities act through natural processes, not in defiance of them. The fact that Apollo chose to speak through a place where geological conditions produced mind-altering vapours would have appeared as additional evidence of divine wisdom, and by no means a refutation of divine presence. Consider this question from the ancient Greeks' perspective. What is the probability of a sacred spring accidentally arising precisely where deep gases create the ideal conditions for a mystical experience? What is the probability that the most spiritually charged place in the Greek world would also be the place where natural processes create a perfect environment for divine dialogue? From the Greek point of view, this was not a mere coincidence. It was a clear manifestation of divine providence. Apollo chose this unique place precisely because its natural characteristics made it ideally suited for his divine purposes. The deity acted through the earth itself, employing the planet's own geological mechanisms to create a space where heaven and earth could connect. Modern scientific investigations into the oracle's trance shed light on several specific features described by ancient chroniclers. Individuals under the influence of mild ethylene intoxication often experience heightened intuition and an ability to discern hidden patterns. They become significantly more receptive to subtle social cues and emotional undertones that might otherwise go unnoticed in an ordinary state. Their thought processes become more associative and metaphorical, freed from the strict logical constraints characteristic of everyday consciousness. Such effects would undoubtedly have made the Pythia extraordinarily sensitive to the non-verbal communication of pilgrims seeking advice. Even without conscious analysis, she would have picked up on body language, vocal inflections, subtle verbal nuances, and other indicators that revealed far more about a person's situation than their direct questions. Combined with her extensive training in psychology and counseling, which was an integral part of the oracle's role, this heightened sensitivity granted the Pythia an almost preternatural understanding of human nature and motivation. The trance state induced by ethylene would also have contributed to greater creativity and flexibility in the oracle's responses. Instead of offering logical, straightforward recommendations based on conscious analysis, she would have drawn upon deep intuitive processes capable of synthesizing complex information in surprisingly insightful ways. This explains why Apollo's prophecies were often enigmatic and metaphorical, rather than direct and literal. The oracle did not aim for mystery's sake. She communicated from a state of consciousness where truth naturally manifests itself in symbols and patterns, rather than in direct assertions. However, gas vapors alone could not be the sole explanation for the accuracy and wisdom of the Delphic guidance. Many people throughout human history have experienced altered states of consciousness without becoming sources of profound spiritual insight. What made the Pythia special was not only her ability to enter trance states, but also her meticulous preparation, her accumulated wisdom, her genuine spiritual development, and her perceptive understanding of human nature. The Delphic Oracle represented a striking fusion of natural and cultural factors. The geological features of the locality provided the physical basis for the mystical experience. The careful spiritual preparation created the psychological foundation for interpreting and transmitting this experience. The organizational support of the temple complex provided the social context that allowed the oracle's wisdom to influence the entire surrounding world. And, perhaps most importantly, the cultural expectations of ancient Greek society formed the interpretive framework that allowed people to hear divine wisdom in the oracle's words, even if those words required thoughtful reflection and creative application to yield true benefit. The oracle's effectiveness was rooted in the collective faith of all its participants, the Pythia, the priests, the pilgrims, in its efficacy. They approached this experience with such an open and receptive attitude that genuine spiritual insight was made possible. They were prepared to listen carefully, reflect deeply, and take responsibility for applying any guidance received. Ethylene vapors were just one element in a complex system that included geology, psychology, spirituality, and culture. Remove any of these elements, and the oracle would never have achieved its outstanding reputation for wisdom and accuracy. Such a scientific understanding of the oracle's mechanisms in no way diminishes its historical and cultural significance. On the contrary, it makes Delphi's achievements even more impressive. The ancient Greeks created an institution that successfully combined natural phenomena, spiritual practice, psychological insight, and social wisdom to produce guidance that contributed to the formation of one of the greatest civilizations in history. They understood, perhaps better than we do, that the sacred and the natural are not opposing categories. The divine acted through the world as it truly is, not through violations of natural law. Apollo spoke through the oracle not by suppressing the normal functioning of consciousness, but by creating conditions in which consciousness could function at its highest and most insightful level. When deep night fell and the pilgrims left the sacred precincts and the temple plunged into silence, when the oil lamps burned low and the mountain was enveloped in peaceful darkness, these mysterious vapours continued to rise from the depths of the earth. The sweet breath of the mountain flowed ceaselessly through the fissures in the temple floor, carrying with it the eternal possibility that divine wisdom remains accessible to any age, any culture, any person who approaches the sacred with genuine reverence and an open heart. However, the oracle represented only one aspect of Delphi's multifaceted sacred life. Throughout the year, the mountain resonated with music and celebration as people from all over the Greek world gathered to honor Apollo at festivals that harmoniously combined religious piety with artistic competitions and athletic achievements. The transformation of this place began long before the festivities, months in advance. Stonemasons arrived to repair damage to the stadium and hippodrome. Merchants erected temporary stalls along every available path. Their colourful awnings formed a labyrinth of commerce, spread across the mountainside like a vibrant tapestry. Innkeepers in the town below expanded their premises, adding rooms and courtyards to accommodate the thousands of visitors who flocked to this sacred site. Every fourth summer, as the season reached its peak and the mountain air shimmered with heat that made the marble temple glow from within, Delphi transformed from a place of quiet pilgrimage into something magnificent and chaotic. It was the site of the Pythian Games, the great festival of Apollo, which brought together the best athletes, musicians, and poets from all corners of the ancient world. However, the spiritual preparations were considered the most significant. Apollo's priests spent weeks performing purification rituals designed to prepare the entire sacred precinct for the intense religious activities of the festival. Every altar was cleansed, every statue was washed and anointed, every building was blessed with incense and prayers. Musicians from Athens, for example, arrived in Delphi 3 days before the official start of the festival, hoping to compete in the musical contests that were the heart of the Pythian Games. Unlike the Olympic Games, which focused predominantly on athletic competitions, the Pythian Games placed equal importance on artistic achievements. For this was Apollo's festival, and Apollo was revered as much as the god of the lyre as he was the god of prophecy. The scene that unfolded before the arrivals was truly unique and unparalleled. The usually quiet mountain paths were filled with people speaking dozens of different dialects, athletes from Sparta and Sicily, poets from the islands, musicians from Greek colonies in Asia Minor and southern Italy. The air buzzed with excitement and nervous energy as participants prepared for competitions that would define their reputation throughout the Greek world. The games themselves were held in honor of Apollo's victory over Python, commemorating the moment when the young god claimed this mountain as his sacred territory. But they were also a celebration of all that Apollo represented: music and poetry, physical perfection, the harmony between body and spirit that the Greeks considered an integral part of a well-lived life. However, this evening, practicing by the light of oil lamps, as the mountain plunged into peaceful darkness around them, the music flowed with a perfection that instilled confidence in them. The strings of their lyre seemed to sing with their own voices, the notes pure and true. The flutist's melody intertwined with their harmonies, like a silver thread through golden fabric. The singer's voice soared above it all, carrying ancient words with such power that everyone who heard stopped what they were doing to listen. The musicians and their companions found lodging in a temporary camp that had sprung up in the olive grove below the sacred precinct. Tents made of canvas and simple wooden shelters housed hundreds of festival participants, creating a temporary city that existed only during the games. Campfires illuminated the landscape, and the smell of roasted meat mingled with the sweet aroma of pine resin and the dusty scent of the summer earth. Their group spent the evening before the opening ceremony rehearsing the hymn to Apollo that they were to perform in the musical competition. It was a piece they had rehearsed for months, a complex composition telling the story of Apollo's birth on Delos and his journey to Delphi to claim the oracle. The melody was intricate, requiring precise coordination between lyre, flute, and vocal. One wrong note, one moment of poor synchronization, and months of preparation could be wasted. The first harbingers of impending upheaval arrived not in the form of military legions or siege engines, but as a simple administrative dispute that seemed almost laughably minor compared to what it would eventually unleash. It was 595 BCE, and representatives from the city of Kira arrived in Delphi with what they considered a perfectly reasonable request. Kira controlled the port where most pilgrims arrived before beginning their journey up the sacred mountain, and the city levied a fee for the use of its port facilities. Now they sought to extend these charges to all offerings brought to Apollo's temple. Deep consternation gripped the priests of Delphi. For centuries, the oracle had subsisted on voluntary offerings from countless pilgrims and influential city-states, gifts generously given in worship of the deity, who bestowed priceless guidance from above. The notion of taxing these sacred donations seemed to them an outright desecration of the very essence of Delphi, a fundamental violation of all its tenets. However, Kira's representatives apparently remained indifferent to these religious arguments. They insistently emphasized that their city provided vital services to Apollo's pilgrims. Port facilities were equipped, storage spaces were available, as was lodging for those travelers who arrived too late to make the ascent to the sacred mountain. Why, they questioned, should their city not receive fair compensation for these necessary services? And why should Delphi reap all the economic dividends from the oracle's activities, while Kira bore the burden of maintaining all the infrastructure that, in essence, made the pilgrimage possible? In its essence, this disagreement could well have been resolved through negotiation and reasonable compromise. It represented a typical commercial dispute, similar to those that Greek city-states regularly resolved by resorting to arbitration or engaging in diplomatic exchanges. However, to the great misfortune of all involved parties, the dispute over port fees became inextricably linked to much larger political tensions that had long been brewing in the Hellenic world. A number of powerful polis were actively seeking ways to enhance their influence over both Delphi and the oracle itself. Athens, for example, aimed to ensure that Apollo's prophecies would invariably serve Athenian interests. Sparta, in turn, harboured the hope of preventing its rivals from gaining excessive control over this crucial religious centre of all Greece. Meanwhile, in northern Hellas, the growing power of Thessaly posed a threat to the traditional balance that had hitherto ensured Delphi's independence from the dominance of any single political force. As soon as the Delphic priests rejected Kira's tax claims, these influential powers immediately saw in it a convenient pretext for intervention. capable of advancing their own strategic interests while creating the appearance of defending religious freedom and sacred traditions. The Amphictyonic League, an ancient confederation of Greek tribes and cities entrusted with the duty of protecting Delphi, loudly proclaimed that Kira's actions were nothing less than sacrilege, directed against Apollo himself. The tax on sacred offerings was presented as direct theft from the deity, a crime so monstrous that its rectification required immediate military intervention. However, in its essence, the matter was by no means limited to the defense of religious tenets. In reality, it was about a struggle for power and control, about who would ultimately have the decisive say in decisions affecting the fate of all Hellas. The ensuing sacred war was to last a full 10 years, drawing all the key powers of the ancient world into its orbit. A young soldier from Athens, like many of his compatriots, found himself part of the expeditionary force dispatched by his city to support the League's actions against Kira. Like most of his comrades in arms, he genuinely believed he was fighting to defend the Oracle from unholy taxation. He had been raised from childhood on tales of Apollo's boundless wisdom and Delphi's exceptional sacred significance, and the very thought that someone would dare to profit from the sincere devotion of pilgrims deeply offended his sense of religious piety. However, the reality of war, when he finally confronted it face to face, proved significantly more complex and morally ambiguous than the simplistic narrative of defending sacred traditions that had initially motivated his enlistment. The siege of Kira began as a standard military operation. The city was surrounded, supply lines cut, and siege engines were erected to breach its formidable walls. But Kira proved to be superbly fortified and adequately supplied, and its defenders fought with desperate bravery, not merely for the preservation of tax policy, but for their homes and families. Months passed without any decisive progress. The siege gradually turned into a grueling war of attrition, consuming colossal resources and yielding extremely meagre military successes. Soldiers on both sides of the front began to seriously question whether the initial dispute was worth such widespread destruction and suffering. However, the political leaders who initiated this conflict had already invested too much prestige in its outcome to allow for a negotiated settlement. Each side steadily escalated its tactics, hoping to achieve a breakthrough that could justify the colossal costs already incurred. Amphictyonic forces began intercepting ships, potentially delivering supplies to Kira, effectively establishing a complete blockade of the entire region, and thereby creating serious economic difficulties for neutral cities whose prosperity depended on maritime trade. Kira responded with audacious raids into League territory, attacking farms and villages that had no direct connection to the main military campaign. What began as a local conflict over taxation rapidly escalated into total war, affecting every corner of the eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes were completely disrupted. Agricultural production sharply declined. Resources that could have been directed toward constructive purposes were irrevocably consumed by military operations that benefited neither side. He participated in fierce battles as he was a soldier and obeyed orders without question, but doubt grew ever stronger in his soul. Did this protracted war bring anything positive to any of its participants? The initial religious righteousness that had served as a powerful impetus for unleashing the conflict gradually gave way to the simple inertia of violence. Each side continued to fight, primarily because the struggle had already lasted so long that any cessation would be tantamount to admitting complete defeat. The turning point came when Solon of Athens, recognized as one of the most respected legal and ethical thinkers of the Hellenic world, put forward a proposal that proved to be both highly effective militarily and symbolically quite appropriate. Instead of fruitlessly continuing the siege, the League forces should redirect the course of the Pistis River so that its waters flowed through Kira's urban water supply system, poisoning the wells with poisonous hellebore, a plant believed to be sacred to Apollo. The plan worked with truly destructive effectiveness. Within just a few weeks, Kira's population became extremely weakened by disease. Completely losing the ability to offer further effective resistance, the city capitulated. Its walls were completely destroyed, and its entire territory was declared sacred to Apollo, with a prohibition on cultivation and settlement henceforth. The victory was met with widespread jubilation, proclaimed as a triumph of divine justice. It was a punishment sent by Apollo himself through the hands of his devoted worshippers. However, he, having seen much war, could not help but acknowledge that divine justice looks strikingly similar to human cruelty when it is implemented through military force. The first sacred war ended with the preservation of Delphi's independence and the elimination of the threat posed by Kira to the Oracle. But it also set a dangerous precedent that would haunt the Hellenic world for many centuries. This was the idea that religious considerations could justify destructive military interventions, and that the defense of sacred traditions might require the complete annihilation of those who dared to threaten them. Moreover, this war fundamentally altered the balance of power that had developed around Delphi itself. The Amphictyony emerged from this bloody conflict significantly strengthened in its authority over the Oracle's activities. The member cities of the Confederation gained substantial influence over the process of selecting priests and, no less importantly, over the interpretation of prophecies. What had previously been a relatively independent religious institution now became much more closely integrated with the political structures of the entire Greek world. Such integration carried with it both obvious benefits and hidden dangers. The Oracle's advice undoubtedly became more politically sophisticated, better adapted to the complex diplomatic realities that shaped relations between cities and kingdoms. However, at the same time, it also became more partisan, more inclined to reflect the interests of the powerful members of the League than to transmit pure, divine wisdom. The First Sacred War, as it was later called by historians, laid the foundation for patterns that relentlessly repeated throughout Delphi's subsequent history. Whenever the Oracle's independence seemed threatened, whenever political forces attempted to subjugate divine guidance to their own ends, military conflict inevitably erupted. However, these wars also vividly demonstrated something extremely important about the Oracle's role in ancient Greek civilization. They showed that people were willing to fight and die to protect their access to divine wisdom, to preserve those sacred institutions that connected human communities to transcendent sources of guidance and meaning. 50 years after the complete destruction of Kira, the Second Sacred War broke out when Phocis attempted to seize control of Delphi by force. This conflict was shorter in duration, but no less brutal, ending with the crushing defeat of the Phocians and the subsequent execution of their leaders, accused of sacrilege. Another century later, the Third Sacred War went down in history as one of the most devastating conflicts in the annals of ancient Greek civilization. Philip II of Macedon skillfully used the dispute around Delphi as a pretext for military interventions that ultimately led to the establishment of Macedonian dominance over the entire Hellenic world. Each of these wars followed a similar tragic pattern. Political tensions provoked conflicts concerning the governance of Delphi or the independence of the oracle. Religious arguments were cynically used to justify military intervention. The resulting war invariably caused much greater damage than the original disagreements warranted. And each time the fighting subsided, the political balance shifted in such a way that the likelihood of future conflicts only increased, rather than decreased. He survived the First Sacred War and returned to Athens, carrying an experience that shaped his understanding of both politics and religion for the rest of his life. He had seen with his own eyes how easily sacred matters could be cynically manipulated to serve purely secular ambitions. He witnessed the profound disconnect between the lofty ideals that inspired soldiers to feats of bravery and the brutal realities that war actually engenders. But he also saw something else, the genuine reverence that ordinary people held for Delphi and the oracle. He understood how shared religious traditions could unite communities that, in other respects, had little in common. And finally, he realized the vital importance of preserving those institutions that remind humanity of its inextricable links to sources of wisdom that transcend both individual desires and collective interests. The sacred wars in ancient Greece reveal both the noblest features and the darkest manifestations of civilization in that era. The willingness to fight for transcendent principles clearly demonstrates the deepest commitment of the culture to spiritual ideals. However, the way these fierce clashes were waged mercilessly exposes the imperfections of human nature, revealing the tendency of even the most elevated religious aspirations to be distorted by pride and power-hungry ambitions, as well as the inescapable inertia of destructive violence. Apollo, speaking through his oracle, invariably provided his guidance and predictions throughout these conflicts. His prophecies served as a tool both for ending wars and for preventing them, offering wisdom that rose above the narrow, partisan views of the various combatants. But the voice of the deity becomes increasingly difficult to discern clearly when unbridled political clamour drowns out profound spiritual silence. When the sacred peak resonates with the clang of weapons rather than the peaceful whispers of pilgrims seeking divine guidance. Military actions also transformed the very nature of pilgrimage to Delphi for ordinary people. What was once an unclouded spiritual journey turned into a significantly riskier and more multifaceted undertaking, prompting vigilance toward political vicissitudes and consideration of potential military threats. Travellers were forced to take into account not only their innermost spiritual questions, but also the complex dynamics of relations between their native cities and the powerful states controlling access to the oracle. Some pilgrims abandoned the endeavour, daunted by the increasing difficulties, preferring to seek divine guidance from local oracles rather than undertake a journey fraught with serious dangers to Delphi. But many others continued their path despite the risks, driven by a deep conviction that Apollo's wisdom, emanating from its very source, surpassed any dangers that such a journey might entail. These faithful pilgrims often found that their experience in Delphi was not diminished, but on the contrary, significantly deepened by the trials they had to overcome to reach the sacred mountain. the relentless effort expended to preserve the ability to access divine wisdom made that wisdom even more valuable when it was finally attained. The sacred wars also demonstrated the astonishing resilience of the Delphic Oracle. Despite many decades of bloody military confrontations, despite repeated attempts by various powerful states to establish control over or manipulate this sacred institution, Apollo continued to speak through his priestess. The fundamental functions of the oracle invariably withstood any political cataclysms capable of crushing entire kingdoms and radically redrawing the political map of the ancient world. Such survival was by no means accidental. The oracle exists because it fulfills deep human needs that far transcend political boundaries and military conflicts. People will always need guidance in moments of fateful decisions, solace in times of universal uncertainty, and connection to sources of higher meaning that extend beyond their momentary existence. As long as these needs persist, institutions like Delphi will inevitably find ways to continue their fundamental activities, regardless of external pressures. However, wars inevitably leave their indelible mark on the oracle's reputation and, consequently, on its influence. What was once considered an unblemished and purely divine institution begins to be perceived as an organization more susceptible to human weaknesses, to the same political pressures and moral compromises that affect all powerful institutions. Prophecies lose some of their mystical power when society begins to recognize the political calculations that sometimes underpin their interpretations. The sacred wars represent a key, pivotal moment in Delphi's centuries-long history, a moment when the oracle's functions within the context of ancient civilization became increasingly complex and ambiguous. The institution remained important and influential, but it could no longer lay claim to the immaculate spiritual authority that had been its hallmark in preceding centuries. And as the Greek world faced new challenges, the rise of Macedonian power, the rapid expansion of Rome, and the profound cultural transformations that would ultimately reshape the entire ancient civilization, the oracle had to adapt again, seeking new approaches to bestowing divine guidance in an increasingly intricate and unpredictable world. But first it would face, arguably, the most severe test of all, the invasion of the most formidable empire the ancient world had ever seen, a threat so comprehensive and overwhelming that only direct divine intervention, it seemed, could save Hellenic independence. In the early summer morning of 480 BCE, even before the first rays of sun illuminated the sky, a messenger arrived in Delphi. His horse, covered in lather, breathed heavily, exhausted from a desperate gallop along the winding mountain paths. He carried news that pierced the hearts of everyone in the sacred precinct with icy terror. Xerxes, with his countless Persian army, had already crossed the Hellespont and was now relentlessly advancing towards Greece with such power that his troops, like a plague of locusts, darkened the very earth. The numbers quoted seemed almost unbelievable. Persian messengers claimed that Xerxes commanded over 1 million warriors, drawn from all corners of his vast empire, which stretched from distant India to the fertile lands of Egypt. His fleet included ships from Phoenicia and Cyprus, Egypt and Ionia, manned by the best and most skilled sailors of the entire ancient world. This was not just another border skirmish or an ordinary political conflict. It was a massive invasion, aiming for the complete conquest and subsequent absorption of the entire Hellenic world into the Persian Empire. Every major Greek polis mobilized all its forces for what could well turn out to be the last battle in history for Hellenic independence. Athens recalled its citizens scattered throughout the Mediterranean. Sparta prepared to lead a united coalition of city-states in a desperate attempt to defend Greek freedom. But even the most optimistic military strategists realized that the chances of victory were overwhelmingly slim, raising the terrifying question that tormented the minds of priests and numerous pilgrims in Delphi. What would happen to Apollo's sacred mountain when the Persians arrived? Xerxes, as was known, showed little respect for Greek religious traditions during his advance through northern Greece. Persian soldiers unceremoniously plundered temples, melted down sacred statues for gold, and converted holy sites into ordinary military camps. There was no reason to assume that Delphi would be treated any differently, despite its undeniable reputation as the most revered and sacred place in all the Hellenic world. The temple treasuries housed untold riches accumulated over centuries: golden statues and silver vessels, exquisite bronze tripods and intricate ivory sculptures, as well as precious gems and rare metals brought from the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean. The total value of these offerings could easily fund military campaigns for many years. No Persian commander in all likelihood would leave such trophies untouched out of any respect for a Greek deity. As for strategic importance, perhaps even more significant was the fact that control of Delphi would give Xerxes a colossal psychological advantage over any Greek polis that dared to continue resisting Persian dominion. If the Delphic Oracle predicted an inevitable Persian victory, if Apollo himself seemed to endorse Xerxes's claim to sole power over all Greece, the moral blow to the spirit of Greek resistance would be truly devastating. Therefore, Apollo's priests found themselves facing a painful dilemma. Should they attempt to evacuate the most precious treasures, securely hiding them in mountain caves or sending them to distant colonies where Persian troops might never reach? Should they try to negotiate with the Xerxes, offering cooperation in exchange for the inviolability of the sacred site? Or should they rely entirely on the omnipotence of their deity to protect his sanctuary himself, however comprehensive and terrifying the threat from mortal armies might seem? For several days, intense debates raged among the temple's elder priests. Some advocated for immediate practical steps, dispersing temple treasures, establishing refuges in the impregnable mountains, and developing detailed contingency plans to ensure the oracle's functions could continue from other, safer locations. Others insisted that such preparations would only demonstrate a lack of faith in Apollo's omnipotence and his ability to protect his sacred abode independently. The discussion reached its climax when scouts brought alarming news. An advanced detachment of Persian troops had been separated from the main army with direct orders to proceed directly to Delphi. These were not mere reconnaissance units or foragers. This was a significant military formation equipped for siege operations, whose objective was clear: to capture the oracle and its untold treasures before Greek reinforcements could arrive and intervene. All the inhabitants of Delphi, priests and numerous pilgrims, as well as merchants and artisans, in short, everyone whose life was inextricably linked to the sacred mountain, faced the terrifying prospect of becoming refugees in just a few days. Some families had already begun packing their most essential belongings. preparing to flee into the impregnable mountains before Persian troops could completely encircle the sacred precinct. However, then something truly extraordinary happened. A delegation of Delphians approached the oracle with a question they had never before had to ask. Should we abandon the sacred site to save our lives? Or should we stay and defend Apollo's sanctuary, even if it means certain death? The Pythia's answer came immediately and was absolutely unequivocal, delivered with such unwavering certainty that it astonished everyone who heard it. The god will protect what is his. Those who trust Apollo fully should not fear mortal armies, however numerous and mighty they may seem. Stay in your places and prepare to witness a divine protection rarely seen by mortals. The prophecies spread rapidly throughout the sacred precinct, bringing both comfort and deep unease to the people who had to decide on its truth. Was it genuine divine guidance, or was the oracle simply uttering words that people wished to hear in the midst of a desperate crisis? Some families, despite the prophecy, still decided to leave Delphi, unwilling to risk their children's lives for what might turn out to be mere wishful thinking skillfully disguised as divine revelation. However, most of the temple staff made a firm decision to stay, fully trusting in Apollo's protection and their deep understanding of the god's omnipotence. 3 days later, the vanguard of the Persian troops was due to arrive. An endless line of professional warriors stretched along the mountain paths, their bronze armor dazzling under the summer sun. Their weapons, impeccably maintained, left no doubt as to their lethal effectiveness. The discipline of these soldiers was evident in the honed precision of every movement and the astonishing coordination in setting up their temporary camp. Watching from the temple steps as this magnificent military machine methodically prepared to storm the sacred precinct, even the most steadfast defenders of Apollo began to harbour doubts, wondering if they had made a fatal mistake. It was clear that the Persians possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and all the necessary equipment to crush any resistance that the small temple garrison could offer. However, at the very moment the Persian commander began his final preparations to attack the sanctuary, inexplicable events began to unfold. The first omen was the weather, which appeared as if from nowhere. The idyllic blue of the summer sky, clear and cloudless just moments before, suddenly gave way to dark clouds that swirled over the mountain peaks resembling smoke from a gigantic fire. In the distance a continuous rumble of thunder began, though there were no visible lightning strikes to explain the sound. The Persian soldiers, hardened veterans of numerous campaigns in the harshest climates, felt a growing unease. This was not an ordinary change in weather. The clouds were too dark, the thunder too constant, and the sudden and sharp drop in atmospheric pressure too dramatic to be considered a natural phenomenon. Then the surface of the earth shook. At first it was a barely perceptible tremor, characteristic of minor seismic activity common in this geologically unstable region. But gradually the earthquake gained strength until the Persian soldiers could barely keep their footing, and their horses reared in panic. The seismic activity reached its peak precisely at the moment the Persian commander gave the order to advance towards the temple. Huge boulders, breaking off the cliffs above the sacred precinct, began to crash down upon the advancing troops. It seemed as if entire sections of the mountain were shifting and sliding, causing avalanches that blocked key routes the Persians needed for a successful assault. But the most terrifying of all phenomena was the light, Witnesses later described a radiance that seemed to emanate from the temple itself, a golden glow that transformed the marble columns into solidified sunlight. The luminescence grew brighter and brighter until Apollo's sanctuary became almost impossible to look at directly, as if the god himself had descended to protect his sacred land. In this blinding brilliance, some Persian soldiers claimed to see figures, tall, luminous beings armed with pure light, standing guard around the temple like divine sentinels. Whether these were genuine supernatural manifestations or hallucinations caused by a combination of fear, earthquake, and unusual atmospheric conditions, their impact on Persian morale proved decisive. The attack collapsed before it had truly begun. Persian soldiers, valiant warriors who had successfully fought in dozens of campaigns, fled in panic from what they perceived as divine intervention. Their commander, realizing that his troops were too demoralized to continue the assault, ordered a retreat to a safe distance to consider further actions. However, Apollo was not finished with the Persian force. That night, as the Persians camped a few miles from the sacred precinct, the attacks continued. Unseen packs of wolves descended from the mountains, infiltrating the Persian camp and attacking sentries and sleeping soldiers. The animals showed no fear of human weapons or fire, continuing their assaults with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. Simultaneously, a mysterious illness began to spread through the Persian ranks. A fever, starting with a few soldiers, quickly infected hundreds, leaving them too weak to fight and too sick to march. Persian doctors were baffled by symptoms they had never encountered before, and their usual remedies proved completely ineffective. By the third day, the Persian commander's patience had run out. He ordered his surviving troops to cease the attack on Delphi and rejoin the main army, reporting to Xerxes that the oracle was protected by divine forces too powerful for mortal soldiers. News of the Persian retreat instantly spread throughout Greece like wildfire, providing a desperately needed boost to the morale of the Greek resistance. If Apollo could protect his own sanctuary from the most powerful army in the world, perhaps the gods had not abandoned Greece to Persian conquest. Perhaps there was still hope for preserving Hellenic independence. The survival of the oracle also had invaluable strategic significance. As Delphi remained in Greek hands, the resistance continued to have uninterrupted access to divine guidance for making crucial decisions. Apollo's prophecies helped coordinate the defensive efforts of the various city-states, providing a unity of purpose that was absolutely essential for any successful resistance to the Persian invasion. Most famously, the oracle gave guidance that helped the Athenians interpret another enigmatic prophecy about wooden walls that were to protect their city. Apollo's advice led them to understand that it was their ships, not the city's fortifications, that represented their best hope for survival, guidance that proved decisive in the naval battle of Salamis. But what actually happened in Delphi during those 3 days when the Persian attack was repelled? Was it genuine divine intervention? Natural phenomena coinciding at a psychologically crucial moment? Or some combination of supernatural and natural factors? Ancient sources differ in details, but they are unanimous in the main outcome. The Persians retreated. Delphi remained in Greek hands, and the oracle continued to function throughout the invasion crisis. Regardless of whether one attributes it to Apollo's direct intervention or an extraordinary confluence of geological and meteorological events, the result was immutable. Greece's most important religious institution survived the greatest existential threat it had ever faced. Modern geological research of the Delphi region confirms that the area is seismically active, and earthquakes frequently cause rockfalls and avalanches of the type described in ancient sources. Weather conditions in the region can also change with dramatic suddenness, especially in the summer months when thermal conditions create rapid atmospheric instability. It is quite possible that the Persian attack occurred precisely at a moment when natural forces were creating conditions that seemed supernatural to people who perceived them as manifestations of divine will. From this perspective, Apollo's protection of his sanctuary acted through natural processes, not against them. The god protected his sacred land by utilizing the mountain's own geological and meteorological features. However, even this naturalistic explanation does not diminish the grandeur of what occurred. The timing was so perfect, the coincidence so dramatically appropriate, that even skeptical observers would have to admit that something extraordinary had taken place. Whether you call it divine intervention or miraculous luck, the undeniable fact remains that Greek morale was bolstered at a moment when it was most desperately needed. The Persian retreat from Delphi became one of the most famous examples of divine protection in ancient literature. This story was told and retold as irrefutable evidence that the gods actively support those who defend sacred traditions and cultural independence. It inspired resistance movements throughout the Persian Empire, encouraging other peoples to believe that their local gods were also capable of protecting them from foreign domination. For the oracle itself, survival in the face of the Persian threat established a new level of prestige and influence. Apollo's prophecies gained additional authority through the demonstration that the god could protect his own sanctuary even against overwhelming military force. Pilgrims travelled to Delphi not only in search of guidance, but also in hope of witnessing the place where divine intervention had saved Greek civilization. The Persian invasion also marked a turning point in the oracle's relationship to political events. Prior to the crisis, Apollo's prophecies generally focused on individual guidance and local disputes. After the demonstration of divine power in international affairs, the oracle became more actively involved in the global political and military issues that shaped the ancient world. This increased political participation brought both new opportunities and dangers. The oracle's advice became more influential in shaping historical events, but it also became more controversial. People began to scrutinize the oracle's prophecies more closely, looking for evidence of political bias or potential manipulation. However, in 480 BCE, as news of the Persian retreat spread throughout the Hellenic world, former fears receded, giving way to the undeniable fact of Apollo's sacred abode being preserved. The deity, whose role was to predict the future, convincingly demonstrated his ability to influence the present when circumstances called for supernatural intervention. And in the subsequent decades, as Greece gradually recovered from the devastating consequences of the Persian Wars, pilgrims continued their journey to the sacred mountain, seeking guidance from a god who had proven that no mortal power, however great, could overcome the divine protection of what is truly sacred. Thus, the oracle continued to live, and with it the most important link in the ancient world between human insight and divine knowledge. Nevertheless, the Persian crisis also vividly highlighted profound changes occurring in the Greek world, showing how complex its political landscape had become. The Oracle had to adapt to continue serving communities that were increasingly engaged in international rather than exclusively local issues. The sacred mountain, once seemingly distant from worldly concerns, transformed into an epicenter of both political and religious influence. And the treasures that pilgrims had for centuries offered to Apollo became not merely symbols of piety, but also embodiments of the wealth and power that made Greek independence truly worth defending. As the traveller ascends the sacred way to Apollo's temple, his path winds among marble structures so elegant and lavishly adorned that each seems designed to make one pause and gasp in awe. These are the treasuries, small temple-like buildings erected by various Greek cities not only to house their offerings to Apollo, but also to display their own prosperity, artistic achievements, and unwavering devotion to the god who speaks through his oracle. Each such treasury tells its unique story, not only that which is carved on its marble friezes or inscribed on its walls, but also a deeper chronicle of a community's relationship with the divine, their understanding of how mortal achievements should be offered in service of transcendent values. The treasury of the Athenians, rebuilt after the devastating Persian wars using marble quarried from Mount Pentelicon, shines with a snow-white brilliance, like fresh snow in the morning sun. Its walls are adorned with metopes, square marble panels depicting the adventures of Theseus and Heracles, masterfully carved by artists whose names are remembered centuries after their demise. However, the true treasure housed within this building is not made of gold or silver. It is a collection of ceramic shards, simple, broken pieces of pottery that were used as ballots in Athenian democracy. When important political decisions needed to be made, citizens wrote names on these ostraca and cast them into urns to determine which leaders would govern their city. Why did Athens decide to dedicate such humble objects in a treasury overflowing with golden cups and silver tripods? The reason lies in the fact that these ceramic shards symbolize something far more valuable than any metal. The principle that ordinary citizens should have a voice in the decisions that shape the future of their community. By dedicating these democratic ballots to Apollo, Athens recognized that its political system depended on both divine wisdom and human judgment. The inscription above the treasury's entrance reads, "The Athenians dedicated this treasury to Apollo from the spoils of Marathon in gratitude for their victory over the Persians." However, the building embodies something more than just a military triumph. It embodies Athens' deep understanding that its democracy and its freedom are gifts from the gods, blessings that require constant appreciation and careful stewardship. Adjacent to the Athenian treasury stands a smaller, yet equally impressive structure, dedicated by the island of Sipnos. This building gained renown throughout the ancient world for its caryatids, columns skillfully carved as graceful female figures, supporting the roof upon their heads. The sculptural work is executed with such refinement that the marble seems to have transformed into living flesh. Each figure expresses its unique aspect of feminine strength and beauty. The Sipnian treasury houses offerings that reflect the island's unique relationship with Apollo. Sipnos was blessed with rich silver mines which provided the prosperity necessary for such generous dedications. However, the islanders realized that their well-being was temporary. Mineral wealth could diminish, mines could collapse. Economic conditions could change in such a way that abundance would overnight turn into scarcity. Therefore, the Siphnians used their temporary wealth to create something enduring, a tribute to Apollo that would continue to honor the god long after their silver mines ran dry. Their treasury became a kind of spiritual investment, exchanging material prosperity for eternal divine favor. The most valuable contents of the building are not made of silver, despite the island's mineral wealth. Instead, the treasury houses a collection of songs, hymns to Apollo, written by Siphnian poets and engraved on bronze tablets that would outlast human voices. These musical offerings demonstrate the islanders' understanding that artistic beauty is more valuable than material luxury, that creating something truly beautiful is the highest form of service to the god of harmony and proportion. The treasury of the Sicyonians tells an entirely different story. Built to commemorate their victory at the first Pythian Games, this circular building departs from the traditional rectangular temple design to create something entirely new and visually striking. Its innovative architecture reflects Sicyont's reputation as a center of artistic experimentation, a city where sculptors and artists developed new techniques that influenced Greek art for centuries. Inside the treasury, alongside the expected offerings of precious metals and exquisite crafts, is a collection of wooden models, miniature versions of theatrical sets used in Sicyonian drama festivals. These humble objects, carved from olive wood and painted with mineral pigments, represent one of humanity's greatest achievements: the development of theatre as a way to explore moral and philosophical questions through stories that engage both intellect and emotion. The wooden models possess no material value, but they are culturally invaluable. They represent a turning point when entertainment became education, when storytelling transformed into a powerful tool for exploring the deepest questions of human existence. By dedicating these theatrical artifacts to Apollo, Sicyon acknowledges the god's role as patron of all artistic endeavors that help people understand themselves and their world more clearly. However, not all treasuries represent successful communities celebrating their achievements. The treasury of the Cnidians houses one of the most poignant collections of offerings ever dedicated in Delphi. It is a series of marble sculptures depicting refugees fleeing their homeland, carrying their most precious possessions in search of new places to build their lives. Cnidus was destroyed by an earthquake that rendered the city uninhabitable. Its population dispersed to colonies and foreign cities throughout the Mediterranean. The survivors pooled their remaining resources to create this treasury as a monument to their lost homeland and a prayer for Apollo's protection during their exile. The sculptures they commissioned are heartbreakingly realistic. Weariness is etched in the carved faces, resolve in the slumped shoulders, and in the overall image, the terrible sadness of people who have lost everything familiar and are forced to start anew in unfamiliar places. But hope is also evident within them, the tenacious human unwillingness to succumb to despair, a belief that even the worst catastrophes can be overcome with divine help and community support. The Cnidian treasury reminds every visitor to Delphi that prosperity and security are fragile gifts, that disaster can befall even the most successful communities, and that true wealth lies not in accumulated possessions, but in the relationships and values that help people rebuild after everything else has been lost. Perhaps the most enigmatic treasury is the one built by the Massaliotes, Greeks from the colony of Massalia, now known as Marseille, in southern France. This building houses offerings that reflect the unique challenges of preserving Greek culture in a foreign land, surrounded by Celtic tribes whose traditions and languages were entirely different from Hellenic customs. The treasury of Massalia contains items that would have seemed strange to visitors from the Greek heartland. Here one can see bronze necklaces worn by Celtic chiefs who became allies of the Greek colonists, silver coins with images mixing Greek and Celtic artistic motifs, weapons combining Greek metalworking techniques with Celtic decorative styles. But the most significant offering is a collection of scrolls containing the Constitution of Massalia, the laws that govern how Greeks can maintain their cultural identity while adapting to life in a foreign environment. These ancient legal acts represent one of humanity's first recorded systematic attempts to regulate the complex problem of multiculturalism. Their essence lay in the formation of institutions capable of carefully preserving indigenous traditions while allowing for practical and flexible adaptation to entirely new circumstances. The Massalian offerings, in turn, vividly demonstrate the comprehensive significance of the god Apollo. This deity's wisdom, as it turned out, extended far beyond the purely Greek-speaking world, offering guidance to any community sincerely seeking heavenly assistance in creating just and harmonious social structures. The authority of the Delphic Oracle spread far beyond the Mediterranean basin, significantly influencing the establishment and development of Greek colonies located in regions such as Spain and France, Egypt and southern Italy. Everywhere Hellenic communities took root in foreign, unfamiliar lands. As the visitor wanders among these magnificent treasuries, he gradually realizes that these architectural structures represent something far deeper than a mere expression of civic pride or pious religious devotion. They, in essence, form a unique spiritual museum, a grandiose collection of the human spirit's greatest triumphs, brought as a sign of deepest gratitude to the divine forces that, in fact, made such achievements possible. Thus, the Corinthian treasury carefully preserved models of ships that pioneered unexplored commercial routes between Greece and the Western Mediterranean. The Aetolian treasury displayed samples of standardized silver coins that ensured the viability of international trade by creating a reliable and universal medium of exchange. And the Theban treasury exhibited samples of weapons and armor, captured in battles that defended Greek independence against foreign invasion. Each of these buildings is designed to extol the diverse facets of human genius and courage. Collectively, they create a comprehensive homage to all that makes civilization possible, from the arts and scientific inquiry to legal norms and religious cults, from commercial activity and martial arts to individual excellence and collective cooperation. However, the treasuries also represented a kind of spiritual competition. Each city strove to make its gift to Apollo surpass the splendor of its rivals' gifts, to make its edifice more elegant, and its dedication grander. This spirit of rivalry transformed religious devotion into a powerful catalyst for innovative solutions in art and architecture. The result was a sacred complex that served as a showcase for the crowning triumphs of Greek civilization. Those who arrived in Delphi were not limited to merely meeting the prophet. They experienced a concentrated embodiment of everything that made their culture worthy of careful preservation and active defense. The artistic competition between the treasuries, in turn, stimulated the continuous development of sculpture and architecture. Masters from various city-states actively exchanged techniques and concepts, giving rise to a fruitful intermingling of creative beginnings, which undoubtedly enriched the entire Hellenic world. Thus, the Athenian treasury influenced the architectural design of the Theban treasury, which, in turn, served as a source of inspiration for innovative solutions in the Argive treasury. Such creative exchange transformed Delphi into an epicenter of both artistic and religious activity. The sacred precinct became a place where the best artists of each generation flocked to showcase their skills and learn new things from their colleagues. The resonance of these interactions spread throughout the Mediterranean, as artists returning to their native cities brought with them fresh concepts and methods. The treasuries, moreover, also played a very significant diplomatic role. They provided an impartial platform where representatives of various cities could meet and consult, completely avoiding the political tensions that might significantly hinder discussions in their homelands. Many critically important alliances and agreements were first discussed in the sacred shadow of Apollo's temple, with the very presence of divine entities encouraging sincerity and good faith in diplomatic exchanges. The offerings, carefully preserved in the treasuries, formed an unbreakable archive of intercity relations. Thus, when Athens and Sparta united to defend Hellas against Persian aggression, their collective offering in the treasury of the Greeks immortalized this cooperation for future generations. And when Corinth and Corcyra resolved a commercial conflict through the mediation of the oracle, their gifts of gratitude documented the peaceful resolution of the dispute for posterity. Over time, these treasuries transformed into repositories of historical reflection as well as spiritual reverence. Future generations could wander among these magnificent structures and grasp the chronicle of their civilization, etched in marble and bronze, realizing how their ancestors overcame trials and achieved triumphs that, in essence, paved the way for their present. However, the treasuries also revealed the true cost of Greek achievements. Many of the most beautiful offerings were created using abundance gained through conquests or ruthless exploitation. The gold adorning Apollo's altars was often extracted by slaves toiling in extremely dangerous conditions. The silver funding artistic projects was sometimes the result of tribute, levied from less powerful polis. This moral complexity added additional depth to the sacred meaning of the treasury. They served as a reminder to visitors that humanity's triumphs are always dual blessings, and that even the most elegant creations can be overshadowed by the circumstances of their origin. Apollo's enlightened wisdom serves as a guide for people through these intricate ethical labyrinths, helping them find ways to create just and aesthetically perfect societies, without losing sight of the costs such societies sometimes impose on others. The Delian treasury perhaps holds the most profound solution to this moral problem. Delos, being Apollo's birthplace, was also one of the largest slave markets of the ancient world. The islanders used their profits from the slave trade to fund lavish dedications to the deity. However, they also established a system of legal protection for slaves and formed institutions promoting the integration of freed slaves into free society. Their treasuries include documentary evidence enshrining these innovative legal norms, demonstrating that communities can recognize the ethical costs of their prosperity, actively working to minimize the harm caused by their economic systems. The example of Delphi convincingly shows how heavenly guidance can inspire humanity to transform unjust institutions rather than simply accepting them as immutable realities. As evening twilight descends, painting the marble treasuries in a palette of golden, rosy, and deep purple hues, the observer realizes that these buildings represent a continuous dialogue between humankind and the divine realm. Each offering is both an expression of gratitude for past mercies and a plea for future guidance. Each treasury is both a celebration of achieved accomplishments and a humble acknowledgement of dependence on sources of wisdom exceeding the limits of human understanding. These treasuries will stand for many centuries, steadfastly enduring earthquakes and enemy invasions, political upheavals, and socio-cultural transformations. Some of them will be damaged and rebuilt. Others will be stripped of their precious contents by conquerors. Still others will gradually weather and decay, as the communities that erected them vanish from the annals of history. However, their profound mission will persist as long as people seek to align their fleeting successes with enduring values. As long as communities wish to dedicate their outstanding achievements to the service of transcendent ideals, the Delphic Oracle invariably continues to utter divine wisdom in response to questions born of human transience. However, the treasuries surrounding Apollo's temple tell another truth. The truth that human genius and heavenly inspiration can harmoniously coexist, giving rise to beauty capable of outliving the civilizations that created it. In these marble buildings filled with gifts of gold and silver, bronze and ivory, the observer can behold both the grandeur and the fragility of human achievements. He gains an understanding of why people invariably ascend this sacred mountain, seeking guidance from a deity who foresees all potential outcomes, all future consequences, all the ways in which the transient choices of mortals can serve immortal purposes. The treasuries of Delphi stand as an unwavering testament to the synergy between human aspirations and divine grace, between fleeting ambitions and eternal wisdom. They serve as a reminder to all who behold them that the crowning triumphs of civilization stem not solely from human vanity, but also from the humble realization that the greatest successes are gifts that must be returned to the primordial sources from which they originally flowed. When the moon disk rises over Mount Parnassus and a silvery glow bathes the ancient stones of Apollo's sanctuary, the sacred mountain of the Oracle plunges into a serene silence that has marked the end of countless days throughout its centuries-long and celebrated history. Pilgrims have already returned to their distant homes, carrying with them the heavenly guidance they sought, and memories of the sacred place where heaven and earth seemed to touch. The priests have completed their twilight rituals, ensuring that Apollo's sanctuary remains pristine and ready to meet any seekers the coming day might bring. The treasuries stand in the lunar splendor, their marble facades securely guarding the gifts that symbolize humanity's gratitude for divine wisdom. However, the true treasure of Delphi is contained in no single structure and locked away in no single hoard. It resides in the realization that wisdom is always open to those who seek it with a genuine heart. That heavenly guidance continuously flows into the world for anyone humble enough to listen, and that the questions asked can sometimes matter more than the answers that seem to be expected. The Oracle of Delphi reminds us that the quest for wisdom itself is a form of worship, that the path to understanding is sacred, regardless of what final destination might be reached. Ascending the mountain path to Apollo's temple, ancient pilgrims discovered not only resolutions to their pressing difficulties, but also a deeper understanding of the mysteries that give life true meaning. And in the silent hours before dawn, when the world pauses in anticipation of night yielding to day, the sacred vapours still rise from the depths of the mountain, carrying with them the eternal possibility that divine wisdom remains accessible to any age, any culture, any person who approaches the sacred with true reverence and an open heart. As the quiet of night descended, a warm good night wish was extended to everyone. It was hoped that the ancient wisdom, mysteriously emanating from Apollo's mountain, would gently guide each person into a world of deep and serene dreams. It is there, in that sacred space of the subconscious, that any troubling questions that once seemed insoluble would find their long-awaited clarity and comprehensive answers, and all of life's quests, be they for truth, meaning, or harmony, would finally reach their ultimate tranquility, finding desired and profound peace